Good evening. Tonight, we're not going somewhere exotic. We're going somewhere far stranger, somewhere your own grandmother might have poured your grandfather's coffee, somewhere a child could be legally struck with a wooden paddle at school, and somewhere a doctor might tell a grieving widow that the cure for her sadness was a small blue pill and a firmer smile. Tonight we're stepping into 1950s America, the decade of chrome bumpers and casserole dinners, the decade that photographed beautifully and underneath the photograph was quietly holding its breath. So before you sink any deeper into your pillow, if you're enjoying this kind of history told slow and soft, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, only if it actually helps you sleep. That's the only metric that matters here. And to the person who left the comment asking for this exact era, thank you. These requests are what shaped this channel, and I read every single one, even at 2 in the morning, which, let's be honest, is when most of you are watching this anyway. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're tucked in tonight, and what time it is where you are. And if you'd rather have this humming quietly through headphones while you drift off, we're also on Spotify now, links in the description. All right, lights down, shoulders down, let the blanket do its job. Before we begin, let's sit with a question for a moment. What does it mean to live inside a decade that insists, with total confidence, that everything is fine, while your own body is telling you something else entirely? What does it mean to raise children while practicing weekly for the end of the world? What does it mean to be told your unhappiness is a chemical imbalance instead of a locked door? The 1950s asked all of these questions without ever quite saying them out loud. Was it a decade of comfort? Or a decade that simply got very, very good at looking comfortable? Welcome to 1951. Your refrigerator hums instead of your icebox dripping. Your husband's cigarette smoke curls politely toward the kitchen ceiling. And somewhere underneath all of it, something is waiting to be said. Settle in. We're going to say some of it tonight. Chapter 1. The kitchen that ran the house. Let's start where the day itself started for most American families. Not the bedroom, not the porch, but the kitchen. Because in the 1950s, the kitchen wasn't a room. It was closer to a job site, and the woman standing in it had clocked in before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. You're standing at your stove in 1953, and it's not even 6:30 in the morning. The coffee percolator is doing its slow, rhythmic gurgle on the back burner. You've already pulled the bread from the box, already cracked the eggs into the bowl, already decided, without writing it down anywhere. Because where would you write it exactly what needs to happen in the next 90 minutes for 4 other people to walk out that door fed, dressed, and unaware of the machine that made it happen? Nobody asked you to build this machine. You just did, the way water finds the shape of whatever container it's poured into. This wasn't laziness or coincidence on anyone else's part. It was architecture. The American home in the post-war years had been designed, quite literally, around a single assumption. A woman would be inside it all day, managing it. Home economics as a discipline had ballooned across high schools and universities throughout the 1940s and into the 50s, training girls not in chemistry or literature with any real depth, but in the specific choreography of running a household as though it were a small, unpaid factory. By 1956, roughly 60% of American high schools offered dedicated home economics tracks, and for many girls, this wasn't an elective, it was assumed. The kitchen itself had been marketed to you as liberation. New appliances, the electric mixer, the automatic toaster, the built-in oven were sold with the promise that they would free up your time. And in a narrow, technical sense, they did. Where your mother might have spent 4 hours a day on food preparation alone, you might spend 2. But the freed hours didn't become leisure. They became new tasks, more elaborate meals, more demanding entertaining standards, more decorative expectations for a home that now had to look effortless as well as function well. Historians would later call this the labor-saving paradox. The machines got faster, but the bar for what counted as a properly run household simply rose to meet them. You iron your husband's shirt collars while listening to a soap opera on the radio, the volume low so it doesn't wake the baby. You've learned to fold a fitted sheet in a way that would look wrong to anyone in the following decade, but looks completely correct to you, because that's simply how a sheet is folded. You've learned which grocer overcharges by a nickel and which one lets you run a tab until Friday. None of this knowledge appears anywhere. It lives entirely inside you, and it will mostly die with you, because nobody in 1953 is writing down the invisible curriculum a housewife masters by 30. The magazines of the era didn't just describe this life, they enforced it gently, relentlessly. Good Housekeeping, McCall's Ladies' Home Journal ran monthly features with titles that today read almost like satire. Is Your Husband's Dinner Worth Coming Home To? Or 10 Ways to Be Prettier by Bedtime. The tone was never cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was cheerful, as if the writer genuinely believed she was doing you a favor by cataloging, in detail, every way you might currently be falling short. And you read them anyway, not because you believed every word, but because the alternative, closing the magazine and admitting you didn't know how you measured up, felt lonelier than the criticism itself. By 10 in the morning, the kitchen is clean again, as if breakfast never happened. You've already planned lunch. You've already started thinking about what you'll serve for dinner, because a woman with no plan by mid-morning is, by 1953's unspoken definition, a woman who isn't quite keeping up. The radio has moved on to another program. The house is quiet in the particular way suburban houses are quiet at that hour. Not peaceful exactly, just paused, waiting for the next round of noise to begin around 3 o'clock, when the school bus turns the corner. For now, though, there's a strange, suspended stillness, and if you let yourself sit in it just for a moment, coffee cooling in your cup, you might notice something underneath the stillness that doesn't have a name yet. You won't examine it too closely. You have too much left to do today for that, but it's there. It's always there. And in about 10 years, a writer named Betty Friedan is going to interview women exactly like you and discover that almost every one of them, independently, describes this exact feeling, this nameless, private ache sitting quietly under a well-run kitchen. She'll call it the problem that has no name. And when the book comes out in 1963, women across the country will read it in secret, in bathtubs and parked cars, and weep with the specific relief of finally being told they weren't imagining it. But that's later. Right now, it's 1953, the coffee's gone lukewarm, and there's a roast to get started before noon. So you get up. You always get up. That was, in its own quiet and largely unthanked way, the real architecture of the American 1950s household. Not the appliances, not the floor plan, but the woman inside it who kept getting up. Chapter 2, Waiting for the Whistle. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself with sirens or headlines. It just becomes part of the furniture. That's what nuclear anxiety was for an entire generation of American schoolchildren in the 1950s. Not a single dramatic terror, but a low, constant hum sitting underneath ordinary Tuesdays. You're 8 years old in 1954. Sitting in a classroom with pale green walls and a coat closet that smells faintly of rubber galoshes. Your teacher, Mrs. Halloran, has a specific tone of voice she uses only for the drill, brisk, a little too cheerful, the tone of an adult trying very hard to make something manageable sound routine. When the bell rings its particular pattern, not the usual bell, a different one, you already know what to do without being told. You slide from your chair. You crouch beneath your desk. You lace your fingers behind your neck. You wait. You don't fully understand what you're waiting for, not in any way that would survive an adult's scrutiny. You know it has something to do with Russia. You know it has something to do with a bomb bigger than any bomb should reasonably be. You know your desk is somehow supposed to help, and you don't question that, the same way you don't question that the sky is blue. It's simply one of the facts of your particular childhood. This was duck and cover. And it was, in the most literal sense, a national policy. Following the Soviet Union's first successful atomic test in 1949, a test that shattered America's brief, comfortable illusion of nuclear monopoly. The federal government moved quickly to build a public information campaign designed to convince ordinary citizens that a nuclear attack, while catastrophic, was survivable with the right preparation. In 1951, the Federal Civil Defense Administration released a short animated film starring an anthropomorphic turtle named Bert, cheerfully demonstrating the duck and cover technique to schoolchildren nationwide. The film was shown for years. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most widely viewed pieces of media of the decade. What the film did not include, and what most classrooms did not discuss, was the actual physics of what a hydrogen bomb detonation would do to a wooden desk, a plaster ceiling, or the human body crouched beneath either one. The scientists who understood this most clearly were rarely the ones writing the pamphlets that reached American living rooms. At home, the subject wasn't handled much better, though for entirely different reasons. Parents in the 1950s, largely themselves veterans of a depression and a world war, had developed a formidable habit of simply not discussing things that couldn't be fixed by discussing them. So the fear didn't get explained. It got absorbed through magazine covers about backyard fallout shelters, through newspaper maps marking your town's distance from likely target zones, through the particular silence that fell over adult conversations whenever a child walked into the room at the wrong moment. In March of 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen device at Bikini Atoll with a yield that caught its own scientists off guard, nearly 1,000 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The resulting fallout drifted farther than predicted, contaminating a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon and sickening its crew with acute radiation exposure. The story reached American newspapers in careful, measured doses, framed less as an alarm and more as a footnote to an otherwise triumphant test. Back in the classroom, none of this geopolitical weight was visible. What was visible was Mrs. Halloran glancing at the clock, calling the all clear, and the class climbing back into their chairs to resume a spelling lesson as though nothing at all had happened. Which in the most immediate sense was true. Nothing had happened. That particular Tuesday, nothing ever happened. But the rehearsal kept happening, week after week, year after year, and rehearsals, even for events that never arrive, leave a residue. Decades later, researchers studying the psychological profile of children raised under sustained Cold War civil defense programs would identify what some called background dread, a diffuse, low-grade anxiety that many of these children carried quietly into adulthood, often without being able to trace its origin to anything specific. Ask them what it was, and many couldn't say. It wasn't a memory of a single terrifying event. It was hundreds of ordinary Tuesdays, each one interrupted by 60 seconds beneath a desk, each one ending in an all clear that somehow never felt entirely convincing. For now, though, outside Mrs. Halloran's classroom window, the sky is a flat, undisturbed blue. The drill is over, there's a spelling test to finish, and in 20 minutes the lunch bell will ring and 80 children will run outside into the sunshine as though the last hour never happened at all, because in the specific practiced logic of the 1950s, that's exactly how you were supposed to carry a thing like this. Quietly, without comment, and straight into recess. Chapter 3. The Man Who Came Before Sunrise. Long before delivery apps and 24-hour supermarkets, there was a quieter kind of convenience, one that arrived in glass, clinking softly against your porch step while the rest of the street was still asleep. You come downstairs in your robe just after 6 in the morning, the house still holding on to the night's chill, and there it is, 2 bottles of whole milk, condensation already beating on the glass, sitting exactly where they always sit, on the 3rd step, slightly to the left, because that's where the milkman always leaves them, and has for the 3 years you've lived in this house. You never see him, not once. He comes and goes somewhere in that narrow window between midnight and dawn, and the only proof he was ever there at all is the milk itself, and the small folded note tucked under the wire carrier if you happened to need something extra that week. This was the rhythm of American mornings for millions of families throughout the 1950s. At the system's peak, an estimated 30 million households received regular home delivery from local dairies, a logistics network so vast and so precisely tuned that many drivers could complete their entire route from memory, adjusting quietly to the small signals each household left behind. An extra pint of cream tucked into a Thursday order usually meant company was expected. A sudden pause in deliveries might mean a family was traveling, or unwell, or simply going through something nobody outside the house needed to know about. The milkman noticed these patterns the way a family doctor might, and like a family doctor, he generally kept them to himself. The milk itself looked different from what would later fill supermarket shelves. Pasteurization was standard by this point, but homogenization, the process that keeps cream evenly distributed throughout the milk rather than rising to the top, was still inconsistently applied. So you'd often find a thick, pale yellow layer sitting at the neck of the bottle, and you'd either shake it back in or skim it off for whatever you were baking that week. It was a small daily reminder that the milk had come from somewhere real, rather than simply appearing, uniform and anonymous, on a shelf. What nobody discussed, because the 1950s rarely discussed the emotional texture of anything if it could be avoided, was what that quiet hour before the household woke up actually felt like. For some women, it was the only truly peaceful stretch of the day, a small pocket of stillness before the demands began. For others, that same silence carried a different weight entirely, not peace, but a kind of holding pattern, the sense of a day not yet begun but already fully mapped out, with no room in it for anything unplanned. The system that delivered this quiet daily ritual didn't last much past the decade that perfected it. By the early 1960s, supermarkets cheaper, open longer hours, stocked with dozens of other products a family might need in the same trip, had begun winning a battle the milkman never quite realized he was fighting. Dairy routes consolidated. Delivery days grew fewer, then stopped altogether in town after town. What replaced the glass bottle was a waxed cardboard carton, mass-produced, indistinguishable from 100,000 others just like it on a fluorescent-lit shelf. The milk itself tasted more or less the same, but something about the morning changed, in a way most people couldn't quite articulate and didn't especially try to. The ritual was gone, and rituals, once lost, tend not to announce their own absence. They simply stop happening, and one day you notice, vaguely, without quite placing why, that mornings don't feel like they used to. Chapter 4. The Box That Rearranged the Living Room. If you wanted to locate the single object that most quietly and most thoroughly reorganized American family life in the 1950s, you wouldn't need to look further than a wood-paneled box that had, at the start of the decade, barely existed in most homes at all, and by the decade's end, sat at the center of nearly every one of them. The delivery men set it down against the far wall of your living room on a Saturday afternoon, and it takes up more space than you expected, its blonde wood cabinet gleaming faintly under the window light. When you plug it in for the first time, the screen doesn't simply switch on, it warms slowly from black to a flickering gray, before an image finally resolves. Your children are already sitting cross-legged on the carpet in front of it, closer than you'd ever normally let them sit to anything, and something tells you, correctly, as it turns out, that this particular arrangement of bodies on the floor is going to become a fixture in this house for years to come. The speed of this shift is difficult to overstate. In 1950, roughly 3 million American households owned a television set. By 1960, that number had climbed past 60 million, the fastest adoption of any consumer technology in the country's history, easily outpacing the refrigerator, the washing machine, even the automobile a generation earlier. It was as though the entire country had been quietly waiting for a reason to stop talking to each other in the evenings, and television arrived as the perfectly polite excuse. Early programming was live, limited, and heavily variety-based. Comedy hours, professional wrestling, the occasional live drama broadcast with all the technical unpredictability that implies. But by the middle of the decade, the schedule had thickened into something closer to a daily architecture. There were sitcoms now, and westerns and game shows, and a rotating cast of familiar faces who appeared in your living room at the same time every single week, more reliably in some sense than most of the actual people in your life. I Love Lucy, which debuted in 1951, became something close to a national event within its first year, drawing nearly 30 million viewers weekly, more than any radio program had ever managed. When the show's writers decided to write Lucille Ball's real-life pregnancy into the storyline, the episode depicting the birth aired on January 19, 1953, and drew an estimated audience share of over 2/3 of the entire television-owning population of the country. Which meant, in the plainest terms, that on one specific winter evening, tens of millions of Americans sat in their separate living rooms, watching the exact same fictional woman have a baby at the exact same moment, a scale of shared national attention that had simply never existed before in quite that form. The television didn't just change what people watched, it changed what they ate and how and where. Swanson's frozen TV dinner, launched commercially in 1953, was engineered specifically around this new furniture arrangement. A compartmentalized tray designed to balance on a lap or a folding stand, positioned at the correct angle to face the screen rather than the family across the table. The dinner table, for many households, quietly lost its function as the evening's central gathering point. Conversation didn't disappear exactly, but it changed shape from something generated between people to something offered up in shared reaction to whatever was playing. What grew quieter in these years is worth naming plainly: the long, unstructured evening conversations that used to fill the hours after dinner, the improvised outdoor play that used to stretch past dusk, the particular skill, largely unremarked upon until it started disappearing, of simply sitting in silence with another person without needing anything to fill it. What grew louder, meanwhile, was the set itself, humming quietly in the corner of nearly every American living room, rarely fully switched off, functioning less like an appliance and more like a new kind of hearth around which the household now unconsciously arranged itself. Ministers gave sermons about it. Psychologists wrote cautious essays about its effect on children's attention and imagination. And the television industry, entirely unbothered by any of this concern, responded in the only way it knew how, by producing more television, and then more again. By the decade's end, the set in the living room had stopped being a novelty entirely. It had become the room's actual center of gravity, furniture arranged to face it, schedules built around its evening lineup, even conversation itself gradually reshaping to accommodate its presence. Nobody voted on this. Nobody announced it. It simply happened, the way most quiet revolutions do, one Saturday delivery at a time, until one day the whole house had rearranged itself around a box that hadn't existed in most homes just a few years earlier. Chapter 5: The Summer That Watched Every Child. There's a particular kind of fear that only surfaces in warm weather, one that has nothing to do with storms or heat, and everything to do with a virus that seemed to choose its victims at random, and mostly chose children. You're a mother standing at the edge of the neighborhood pool in the summer of 1952, and you're not swimming, and you're not really relaxing either. You're watching. You're counting the days since the last case was reported in your county, a number you know without meaning to have memorized it. You're noticing, almost against your will, which children look a little flushed, which ones seem to be limping slightly, which ones complained of a headache at breakfast that morning. You wouldn't call this behavior anxious if someone asked you directly. You'd call it being careful. In the summer of 1952, being careful looked exactly like this. Polio, or infantile paralysis, as it was often called at the time, had circulated in American communities in seasonal waves since the turn of the century, but the epidemics of the early 1950s represented its most severe and most widely feared period. In 1952 alone, nearly 58,000 cases were reported across the United States, the worst single year in the nation's recorded history with the disease. Of those cases, more than 3,000 people died, and over 20,000 were left with some lasting degree of paralysis. And in a cruel irony that public health officials of the time struggled to explain, the disease seemed to strike hardest in exactly the neighborhoods that were otherwise thriving. The well-kept post-war suburbs, with their public pools and crowded playgrounds and busy summer movie matinees, turned out to be ideal conditions for the virus to spread among children who, thanks to improved sanitation, had built up less early immunity than earlier generations. The disease's most visible and most frightening symbol was the iron lung, a massive metal cylinder that enclosed a patient's body from the neck down, mechanically compressing and releasing to breathe for those whose respiratory muscles the virus had paralyzed. Hospital wards during epidemic season would sometimes hold entire rows of these machines, each one framing a child's face at one end, some children remaining inside them for months, a smaller number for years. Nurses moved between the rows checking pressure gauges and reading aloud to patients who couldn't turn a page themselves. Parents stood in doorways, because that's often as close as they were permitted to get, wearing an expression that doesn't have a name because nothing quite prepares a person for it. Progress against the disease had been building quietly for years by the time it finally arrived. Jonas Salk, working with funding substantially provided by the March of Dimes, a foundation whose fundraising campaigns famously ran through American schoolchildren collecting spare change in small cardboard folders, had spent the early years of the decade developing a killed virus vaccine. On April 12, 1955, the 10th anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt's death, the results of the vaccine's massive field trial were formally announced as safe and effective. The public response to that announcement was almost unlike anything else in 20th century American medical history. Church bells reportedly rang in some towns. Schools let children out early. People wept openly in pharmacies and on street corners, not from grief, for once, but from something closer to disbelief that the thing hanging over every summer for years had finally, actually, been answered. Salk became a national figure almost overnight, in the specific, uncomplicated way reserved for people who solve a fear an entire country has been quietly carrying. Vaccination campaigns rolled out rapidly through schools and public health clinics across the country. By the end of the decade, polio case numbers had dropped by more than 90% from their early 1950's peak. Public pools reopened without the same hesitation. Summer camps resumed their normal schedules. And summer itself, for an entire generation of parents, slowly began returning to something resembling its ordinary texture: heat, noise, and children who were, overwhelmingly now, simply going to be fine. And yet, you still watch your children a little more closely than you probably need to, even years later, even after the worst of it has clearly passed. Some fears, once they've settled into a parent's body, don't fully leave just because the thing that caused them has. That particular vigilance, quiet and mostly private, would linger in an entire generation of parents for far longer than the epidemic itself ever did. Chapter 6: The Man Who Held the List. There's a specific kind of danger that doesn't require evidence to function. It only requires an accusation, delivered publicly enough, and repeated often enough that people forget to ask where it came from. You're a school teacher in a mid-sized American city in 1952, and roughly 8 years earlier, in a very different phase of your life, you attended a handful of meetings held by a local workers' education group. The kind of gathering that, at the time, felt more like a discussion club than anything resembling a conspiracy. You went 4, maybe 5 times. You found the conversations interesting. You moved on with your life not long after, the way people generally do with things that turn out to matter less to them than they briefly seemed to. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrives. A former acquaintance from that same group, called before a congressional committee and placed under considerable pressure, has provided your name as someone he recalls attending those meetings alongside him. You are now, in the specific and consequential language of the era, a name. And in 1952 America, being named was very often functionally identical to being guilty, regardless of what, if anything, you had actually done. This was the operating machinery behind what came to be known as McCarthyism, named for Senator Joseph McCarthy, who first rose to national prominence on February 9, 1950, when he stood before a Republican women's group in Wheeling, West Virginia. Holding a sheet of paper he claimed listed the names of over 200 communists currently employed within the U.S. State Department. The exact number he cited shifted from speech to speech in the months that followed, sometimes over 200, sometimes far fewer, but the underlying certainty in his delivery never wavered. He didn't need the specific figures to hold together. He needed the country to already be afraid. And by 1950, with the Soviet Union newly in possession of the atomic bomb, China recently fallen to communist control, and American soldiers actively fighting in Korea, the country largely was. The machinery of this fear extended well beyond government offices and into the entertainment industry. The Hollywood blacklist, at its broadest reach, ultimately affected several hundred writers, directors, and performers, some of whom held genuine past affiliations with the Communist Party, though many did not. The distinction, in practice, mattered far less than the accusation itself. Studios, facing pressure from the House Un-American Activities Committee and threats of organized boycotts, simply refused to employ anyone whose name had surfaced in testimony. Writers who found themselves blacklisted sometimes worked under pseudonyms for years. Dalton Trumbo, one of the so-called Hollywood 10, imprisoned for contempt of Congress after refusing to testify, continued writing screenplays under assumed names throughout the 1950s, at one point winning an Academy Award under a name that wasn't his own, an award nobody stepped forward to publicly claim for several years. The mechanism that made all of this function was, in its own bleak way, remarkably simple. The accusation itself was the punishment. Conviction of any actual wrongdoing was never required. Simply being named was often sufficient to end a career by the following week, because employers couldn't risk the professional association, and colleagues frequently couldn't risk being seen defending someone who had been named, for fear of becoming the next name themselves. Fear, once it starts moving through a professional network this way, tends to move with remarkable efficiency, largely because everyone involved is protecting themselves rather than any particular belief. McCarthy's public unraveling, when it eventually came, arrived largely through the same medium that had helped fuel so much of the decade's anxieties in the first place, television. On March 9, 1954, journalist Edward R. Murrow devoted a half-hour of his CBS broadcast almost entirely to McCarthy's own recorded words and contradictions, allowing the senator's own footage to undercut him far more effectively than any outside commentary could have. Later that same year, the televised Army McCarthy hearings allowed the American public to watch the senator operate in real time, bullying witnesses, contradicting his own prior statements, pursuing lines of questioning that grew increasingly untethered from any clear purpose. On June 9, 1954, when Army Counsel Joseph Welch finally asked him, on live television, whether he had no sense of decency, the hearing room fell into a silence that television cameras captured with unusual clarity. The Senate formally censured McCarthy later that same year. He died in 1957, his influence by then largely diminished, though the broader infrastructure he had helped build, the informal networks of suspicion, the professional cost of association, the habit of assuming the worst about anyone publicly named, didn't disappear nearly as quickly as the man himself did. The The people whose careers had already ended rarely got them back in full. And the ones who had provided names under pressure carried that decision quietly for the rest of their lives, filed away in the particular part of memory reserved for things people did in order to survive a moment, and generally preferred not to examine too closely afterward. Chapter 7. The Map Nobody Wrote Down. There are systems of control so thoroughly woven into daily life that the people benefiting from them rarely notice they exist at all. In the American South of the 1950s, and in quieter, less codified forms throughout much of the North, that system was racial segregation. And for millions of Black Americans, it wasn't an occasional injustice. It was simply Tuesday. You're a father living in Birmingham, Alabama in 1953, walking your young son to the shoe store downtown, and the walk itself is a kind of continuous, silent negotiation. You know which entrance you're permitted to use. You know which drinking fountain is marked for you and which one isn't. You know that when the white shopkeeper addresses you by your first name, despite being younger than you and having met you only moments ago, you're expected to answer him as sir. None of these rules exist written down in any single place your son could look them up and study. They're distributed instead across the entire visible architecture of the city, its signage, its customs, its unspoken but perfectly understood threat of violence for anyone who tests a boundary too openly. To the white shopkeeper, none of this registers as a system at all. It simply looks like how things are. That invisibility to the people it protects is very much the point. The legal scaffolding underneath this daily reality had been in place since the 1870s, reinforced by the Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which established the doctrine of separate but equal as constitutionally sound, a phrase that, in practice, delivered separation with remarkable consistency and equality almost nowhere at all. By the 1950s, this doctrine had shaped nearly every visible institution across much of the country. Segregated schools, segregated hospitals, segregated hotels, segregated beaches, segregated waiting rooms in train stations that otherwise looked identical to the ones reserved for white travelers just a few feet away. Even the era's most celebrated engine of post-war prosperity, the GI Bill, extended its benefits unevenly. While it funded college educations and low-interest home loans for millions of returning veterans, its administration on the ground, often left to local banks and universities, frequently excluded Black veterans from the same opportunities, whether through outright refusal or through bureaucratic obstacles that white veterans simply never encountered. The new suburbs rising on the edges of American cities throughout the decade were, by deed restriction and by federal lending policy alike, overwhelmingly reserved for white families only. In 1954, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education formally overturned Plessy, declaring racially segregated public schools unconstitutional after more than half a century of precedent. The reaction across much of the white South was immediate and furious. A coalition of Southern politicians signed what became known as the Southern Manifesto, publicly pledging resistance to desegregation. School boards, where they moved at all, moved with deliberate, grinding slowness. In Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, the governor called out the state's National Guard specifically to prevent 9 Black students from entering Central High School. A standoff so severe that President Eisenhower ultimately felt compelled to deploy federal troops from the 101st Airborne Division simply to escort 9 teenagers safely into their own classrooms. Those 9 students walked through jeering crowds and hostile hallways for months. They stayed anyway. It's worth pausing here on one detail that popular memory has often simplified into something smaller than it actually was. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in December of 1955, the story that circulated for decades afterward often described her as simply a tired seamstress acting on impulse. She was, in fact, far more deliberate than that framing suggests, a trained civil rights organizer serving as secretary of the local NAACP chapter, who had recently studied organizing strategy at the Highlander Folk School. Her arrest that evening was not a spontaneous act of exhaustion. It was a calculated act of resistance, carried out by a woman who understood precisely what it would likely cost her, and chose to accept that cost anyway. The 381-day boycott that followed required an extraordinary, sustained feat of community organization and discipline, coordinated across an entire city for more than a year. For much of white America watching from the outside, this entire unfolding movement registered primarily as inconvenience and disruption, an arrangement that had, after all, worked perfectly well for them for generations and showed no particular sign, from where they stood, of needing to change. Genuine change would require something the decade wasn't especially built for: a direct confrontation with the comfortable assumption that the way things had always been was simply, naturally, how things were meant to stay. Chapter 8: A House That Looked Like Every Other House. After the war ended, millions of American families packed up their city apartments and moved toward something new: a stretch of land on the edge of town, laid out in identical rows, promising a lawn, a driveway, and a version of the American dream that had, until very recently, felt entirely out of reach for people of modest means. You're a young veteran in 1949, and you've spent the last several years first in a cramped, Depression-era apartment shared with siblings you'd rather not still be sharing a bedroom with at your age, and then in the considerably more dangerous cramped quarters of a war you'd prefer not to describe in much detail to anyone who wasn't there. Now you're standing in front of a small, freshly built two-bedroom house on what used to be farmland, and it isn't large, 800 square feet, one bathroom, a kitchen you could cross in 4 steps, but it has a yard. Your children will be able to play in that yard, and you'll be able to watch them do it from your own kitchen window, in a house that belongs, for the first time in your life, entirely to you. Your hand isn't quite steady when you sign the mortgage papers. You don't especially mind that it isn't. This was Levittown, and the man behind it, William Levitt, had approached residential construction with the same logic an assembly line brings to manufacturing. Levitt owned his own lumber operations. He controlled his own nail supply. He broke the entire construction process down into 27 distinct, sequential steps, with specialized crews moving down the street performing one task each before the next crew arrived behind them. A system so refined that, at peak efficiency, a finished house could be completed roughly every 16 minutes. The homes sold for under $8,000, financed largely through Veterans Administration loans that required no down payment for eligible buyers. Waiting lists for these houses reportedly stretched for miles. What the sales brochures didn't advertise, and what the mortgage paperwork made explicit in far quieter language, was a standard deed covenant restricting the sale or rental of these homes to members of the white race. This wasn't an isolated eccentricity specific to one developer. Racially restrictive covenants were standard practice across post-war suburban development nationwide, further reinforced by Federal Housing Administration guidelines that explicitly rated integrated or predominantly black neighborhoods as poor lending risks, a practice that came to be known as redlining. The entire wealth-building machinery of post-war American homeownership, the equity that appreciated quietly over decades, the property that got passed down to the next generation, had been engineered deliberately, with a locked gate built directly into its foundation. The suburb also had a texture that only fully revealed itself once you'd actually settled inside it. Its distance from the city, from workplaces, from any real variety of daily life, was manageable only if you had reliable access to a car. Women who didn't drive, or families sharing a single vehicle that left with the husband each morning, often found themselves quietly stranded in a landscape of look-alike houses with no public transit, and often nowhere within walking distance worth walking to. neighbors, meanwhile, tended to be friendly in a way that somehow made real closeness surprisingly difficult to locate. Everyone pleasant, everyone similar, and genuine intimacy, somehow still managing to stay just out of reach. By the close of the decade, this suburban model had become the dominant residential form across the country, and along with it came a very particular, very quiet strain of dissatisfaction, one that would go on to fuel an entire decade's worth of literature, therapy, and eventual social upheaval in the years that followed. But for now, in 1953, the lawn is green, the mortgage payment is manageable, and the children are visible from the kitchen window exactly as promised. It would feel almost ungrateful to suggest that something, somewhere, still feels slightly unfinished. So mostly, nobody says it out loud. The lawn gets mowed instead. Chapter 9. The Pill That Made Everything Softer. By the middle of the 1950s, there was a small pink tablet sitting in medicine cabinets across suburban America, and it had, within just a couple of years, become the most widely prescribed drug in the entire country. Its name was Miltown, and it was handed out generously, casually, almost reflexively, to women who described to their doctors a feeling they struggled to name, a persistent tension, a low-grade unhappiness, a restlessness that had no obvious cause and therefore no obvious cure. You're 34 years old in 1957, sitting across from your family physician, and you haven't described anything dramatic to him. No breakdown, no crisis, nothing he could point to as a clear medical emergency. You've simply said that you feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, and tense in a way you can't quite locate the source of, and that your mind keeps circling back to thoughts you're fairly sure aren't worth the space they're taking up in your head. He listens for a reasonable amount of time. He asks whether you've been sleeping well. Then he writes a prescription, and the appointment, start to finish, takes about 12 minutes. You fill it at the drugstore on your way home, and that evening, standing at the kitchen sink, you take the first tablet with a glass of water. By dinner, something in your chest has loosened slightly, and you can't quite say whether that's the medication working or simply the relief of having finally been given something, anything, to do about the feeling. Miltown, chemically known as meprobamate, was introduced to the American market in 1955, and within 2 years had become, by a wide margin, the fastest-selling pharmaceutical the country had ever seen. Pharmacies reportedly ran short of supply at points. A modest black market for the drug emerged. Celebrities discussed it in interviews with the same casual tone they might use to describe a new brand of aspirin. Comedian Milton Berle even joked about his own use of it so openly that he picked up the nickname Milton Berle in the press. What made the drug's marketing notable wasn't that it was positioned as a serious psychiatric medication. It wasn't. It was framed instead as something closer to a mild relaxant, gentle enough to take the way you might take something for a headache, except this particular ache was located somewhere the culture of the era had decided was simply the natural condition of the American housewife. The underlying demand for this kind of chemical calm wasn't irrational when you look at it plainly. It was, in many respects, a logical response to a problem that had no available structural solution. Educated women were being funneled, almost without exception, into a domestic role that offered little intellectual stimulation, no professional recognition, no financial independence of their own, and few socially acceptable ways to express dissatisfaction with any of it. The medical establishment of the era, composed overwhelmingly of men, tended to interpret the resulting distress as an individual medical symptom rather than a broader social condition. And so the solution offered was pharmaceutical. Adjust the woman's internal chemistry until the environment around her became easier to bear. This was called treatment, and in the narrowest, most immediate sense, it often worked. A newer, more potent successor, Valium, would arrive by 1963 and go on to eclipse Miltown's reach entirely, becoming by the early 1970s the single most widely prescribed medication in the entire Western world, the overwhelming majority of those prescriptions written for women. None of this reflected some coordinated conspiracy. Most of the physicians involved genuinely believed they were helping their patients. What they were doing, more precisely, was treating a symptom while leaving the underlying condition that produced it entirely untouched. A bit like handing someone a stronger pair of sunglasses instead of ever repairing the broken window letting in the glare. What this entire quiet pharmaceutical era ultimately revealed, when examined honestly, was a decade-long medical consensus that women's emotional distress was fundamentally a chemistry problem, not a social one, not a structural one, and certainly not one worth the discomfort of actually restructuring anything. The pill made things a little softer, a little more distant, a little more bearable, and for many women, in the total absence of any other available option, it genuinely did. That it worked in that narrow, functional sense was, in its own quiet way, precisely the problem. Chapter 10. A screen, a speaker, and somewhere to be. Before shopping malls became the default gathering place for American teenagers, there was a wide, flat stretch of asphalt, a towering outdoor screen, and a small metal speaker that hooked awkwardly onto a rolled-down car window, the drive-in theater. And for an entire generation of young people, it was less about the film playing than about the specific freedom of simply being somewhere together, technically in public, while remaining almost entirely alone. You're 17 years old in 1956, and you've borrowed your father's car for the evening under a story that was, at best, loosely accurate. Your date is beside you in the passenger seat. The speaker hung on the half-open window crackles and hisses with a tinny, distant quality, and the movie playing on the screen ahead of you is, if you're being honest, almost entirely beside the point. You're here for the same reasons nearly everyone else parked around you is here. A bit of privacy, a bit of proximity, and the simple social cover of having something to be ostensibly watching. The drive-in concept had actually originated back in 1933, when a New Jersey entrepreneur named Richard Halshead mounted a projector to the hood of his car and strung a bedsheet-sized screen between two trees in his own driveway, charging a modest admission for the novelty. The idea grew slowly through the following 2 decades before exploding in the post-war years. Once Americans had both the cars and the disposable income to support it, and crucially, teenagers with free time and no particularly private place at home to spend it. By 1958, more than 4,000 drive-in theaters were operating across the country, at one point outnumbering conventional indoor cinemas entirely. What made the drive-in genuinely different from an indoor theater wasn't the screen size or the film selection. It was the car itself, which functioned as a small, self-contained private room in a decade that otherwise offered teenagers almost no private space of their own at home. Surrounded by hundreds of other similarly self-contained vehicles, each one quietly running its own small, unremarkable drama behind fogged glass, young couples found a version of privacy that simply didn't exist anywhere else in their daily lives. Younger children, meanwhile, often watched cartoons from the backseat in pajamas until they fell asleep partway through, eventually carried inside by a parent once the second feature began. The whole experience came wrapped in a specific, slightly greasy food culture of its own: popcorn, hot dogs, sodas served in containers designed to balance on a car door tray, and an intermission reel between features that featured cheerful, dancing concession stand mascots urging you toward the snack bar in a jingle that, decades later, former teenagers of the era could still hum from memory without quite remembering where they'd first heard it. The drive-in's decline began in earnest through the 1960s and 70s, as rising land values made the sprawling lots increasingly expensive to maintain, and indoor multiplexes offered tighter, more controlled, and eventually more climate-friendly alternatives. By the 1980s, thousands of drive-ins nationwide had shut down permanently. Today, fewer than 300 remain in operation across the entire United States, each one standing as a small, stubborn monument to a very particular kind of pleasure, going somewhere specifically to watch something, while quietly, deliberately, staying inside your own car the entire time. The technology has changed considerably since then. The underlying instinct, it turns out, hasn't changed nearly as much. Chapter 11. The Paddle in the Desk Drawer. In the 1950s, striking a child wasn't considered a controversial parenting choice requiring justification. It was simply the accepted method, practiced at home, endorsed from the pulpit, and formalized in many schools as official institutional policy. You're 6 years old and you've just done something, knocked over a glass at dinner, talked back at exactly the wrong moment, failed to come inside when called for the third time. The consequence that follows is immediate, physical, and delivered without any particular anger, by a parent who genuinely believes this is the correct response, largely because their own parents responded the same way and their grandparents before that. The sheer continuity of the practice functions in its own circular way as its own proof that it works. You cry. You're told to stop crying, or there will be more reason to. Eventually you stop, or at least you stop the parts of it that are audible. At dinner that same evening, nobody mentions what happened an hour earlier. The potatoes get passed around the table exactly as they would on any other night. The lesson, as far as anyone in the room is concerned, has already been fully delivered. The legal and cultural permission granted to parents over their children's physical treatment in this era was, for all practical purposes, close to absolute. Schools operated under a legal doctrine known as in loco parentis, literally, in the place of the parent, which in day-to-day practice meant teachers and school administrators carried nearly the same authority over a child's body that a parent did, and parents themselves faced few meaningful limits at all. Paddling was standard disciplinary procedure across most American states throughout the decade. Some school districts maintained formal written policies specifying exact numbers of strokes per category of offense, sometimes requiring a witness present in the room. Others left the entire matter to a teacher's individual discretion. Either way, the paddle typically hung visibly in the principal's office, less a hidden instrument than a fully acknowledged deterrent that every student in the building understood and expected. The theological reasoning supporting the practice was cited widely and with considerable confidence, most often a loose paraphrase of a well-known line from the book of Proverbs, invoked as though its meaning were entirely self-evident and beyond debate. Religious parenting manuals of the period routinely recommended physical correction as a component of proper Christian child-rearing, drawing a careful, and, to modern eyes, rather strange, distinction between punishment delivered in anger, which was considered excessive and inappropriate, and punishment delivered calmly and deliberately for a clearly understood rule violation, which was considered not just acceptable but responsible parenting. The calm delivery in this framing was precisely what made it acceptable. The dominant psychological theory of American child-rearing through this period offered little pushback. John B. Watson's behaviorist model, which had shaped mainstream thinking on parenting since the 1920s, held that children were shaped almost entirely through conditioning, reward paired with desired behavior, punishment paired with undesired behavior, stimulus met reliably with response. Physical punishment fit neatly and immediately into this framework. Whether it produced any deeper internal moral development, or simply trained a child toward external compliance out of fear, wasn't really a question behaviorism as a discipline was especially interested in asking. The substantial body of research eventually linking corporal punishment to increased aggression, poorer long-term mental health outcomes, and damaged parent-child relationships wouldn't emerge until decades later. The 1950s simply didn't have that data yet, and operated instead on a consensus so complete and so unquestioned that it didn't register at the time as a consensus at all. It was simply what you did, until, eventually, The children raised this way grew up, had children of their own, and found themselves confronting, often for the first time in their family's history, a genuine and uncomfortable question about whether the thing done to them had actually been right. Some continued the practice without much reflection. Others stopped, sometimes with the faintly startled realization, mid-sentence, that they were about to say something their own parent used to say and had to decide in that instant whether to actually finish the sentence. Chapter 12. The Institution at the Edge of Town. Every American community in the 1950s had one, a large, imposing building somewhere just outside town, rarely discussed directly, understood by everyone nearby as the place where people went when their behavior had become, in the vocabulary of the era, too much for their family or community to manage on their own. You're a 31-year-old woman in 1953, and your husband has just signed the admission paperwork. The reasons listed on the form include emotional outbursts, an unwillingness to maintain the household to his satisfaction, and what he has described, somewhat vaguely, to the admitting physician as an inappropriate attachment to a female neighbor. The physician's own notes, filed separately, mention something closer to the truth of what's actually being punished here. You're admitted on a Friday afternoon. Nobody tells you how long you'll be staying, because nobody involved in the decision considers that a question that belongs to you. At its peak in the 1950s, the American state hospital system housed approximately 550,000 patients, more than at any point before or since in the country's history. These institutions were vast, chronically understaffed, and operating with a broad and often poorly defined mandate to manage almost any form of behavioral or psychiatric difference using the limited tools available at the time, tools whose actual effectiveness was frequently indistinguishable, in practice, from tools that did active harm. Admission in most states required little more than the signature of a family member and a physician. Discharge, by contrast, required the institution's own agreement, an asymmetry that effectively defined the entire system. Among the treatments administered with some regularity was insulin coma therapy, which involved deliberately inducing a hypoglycemic coma through large insulin doses, then reviving the patient with glucose. A cycle sometimes repeated several times a week over a period of weeks or months, based on a theory of therapeutic benefit that remained thin and contested even within psychiatry at the time. Electroconvulsive therapy was also commonly administered, frequently without anesthesia, meaning patients remained fully conscious through the application of electrical current and the resulting full-body convulsion, a procedure that not infrequently produced fractures from the sheer physical force involved. For gay men and women specifically, the institution often functioned as a site of coercive attempted conversion. Homosexuality remained formally classified as a mental disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Manual until 1973, a classification that provided the medical justification for institutionalization, so-called aversion therapies pairing same-sex attraction with induced nausea or electric shock, and in more severe cases, surgical intervention. Outcomes ranged widely, from patients who reported subsequent years of genuine private misery to a smaller number who never fully recovered any recognizable version of who they had been before admission. The eventual deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s would empty most of these state hospitals, releasing hundreds of thousands of patients back into communities that were, by almost any honest measure, entirely unprepared to receive or support them. That the hospital system had been a deeply inadequate solution was, in hindsight, obviously correct. That the alternative was ready to replace it was not. But throughout the 1950s, before any of that reckoning arrived, the institution sat quietly at the edge of nearly every American town, simultaneously a destination, an implicit warning, and for families who found a relative's difference too inconvenient to manage, a remarkably efficient method of simply making the problem disappear. Everyone in town generally understood this. Almost nobody said it quite that plainly out loud. Chapter 13. The Music That Frightened a Nation. When Elvis Presley appeared on national television in 1956, the network cameras made a deliberate decision to film him only from the waist up. His hips, network executives had determined, were simply too provocative for broadcast into American living rooms. This wasn't a joke or an exaggeration for effect. Parent groups organized formal meetings about it. Ministers built entire sermons around it, and members of Congress seriously discussed the cultural danger posed by a new musical genre that had, in barely a few years, taken over the airwaves and the record players of American teenagers everywhere. You're 44 years old in 1956, and your daughter has just placed a record on the player in the living room, and what emerges from the speaker is unlike anything you'd recognize as music in any prior sense of the term. It's loud. It carries a physical, rhythmic pulse that seems to arrive in the body before it ever reaches anything resembling melody. The man singing sounds, frankly, as though something is happening to him that would probably be more appropriate to experience in private. Your daughter, meanwhile, is moving to it in a way that's going to require you a few minutes to fully process. You cross the room, lift the needle off the record, and she looks back at you with an expression you're going to be seeing a great deal more of over the following several years. You glance at the label. It reads Elvis Presley. You put the record in the trash. The moral panic surrounding rock and roll wasn't manufactured by any single organization, though several were more than willing to claim credit for stoking it. It arose out of a genuine cultural collision. Music that Black American artists had been creating for decades, drawing on rhythm and blues, gospel and boogie-woogie traditions, had begun crossing over into mainstream white teenage listening in a way the country's segregated cultural infrastructure had never fully anticipated or prepared to prevent. Radio was the primary vector for this crossover. Cleveland disc jockey Alan Freed began playing rhythm and blues records to a mixed-race listening audience as early as 1951, popularizing the term rock and roll, borrowed, notably, from black vernacular, and the audience for this new sound grew at a pace that alarmed a wide cross-section of American adults, for reasons that weren't always fully or honestly articulated. The stated concerns tended to center on two familiar themes. There was worry about sexuality. The music felt too physical, the accompanying dancing too suggestive, in a culture that had constructed elaborate systems specifically designed to avoid acknowledging that its teenagers had bodies with impulses of their own. There was also worry about juvenile delinquency. Fed by a handful of widely publicized incidents of rowdy behavior at rock and roll concerts that the press eagerly covered as evidence of broader social decay. Beneath both of these stated concerns sat a largely unstated third one. This was, at its roots, black music, and the white teenagers dancing enthusiastically to it were crossing a cultural boundary the decade had worked very deliberately to maintain. Formal record-burning events were organized in several cities. Radio stations quietly banned specific songs from their playlists. The Catholic Youth Organization actively campaigned against rock and roll concerts in Catholic communities. Several state legislatures in the South introduced bills specifically targeting the genre. Congressional hearings at one point even explored a claimed link between rock and roll, juvenile delinquency, and communist cultural influence. The theory being, with a straight face, that the music itself functioned as a kind of Soviet weapon designed to corrupt American youth from within. Elvis Presley himself was, of course, never the genre's originator. Artists like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Big Joe Turner had been creating this music for years, while being systematically shut out of the larger commercial rewards it eventually generated. White cover versions of their songs, recorded by artists like Pat Boone specifically for white radio audiences, frequently outsold the original recordings by a wide margin. The recording industry extracting the music from its actual creators with the same practiced efficiency it had applied to black artistry for decades before. The teenagers listening anyway, through late-night radio broadcasts, through record store visits, through an older cousin's private collection, carried this music forward into the following decade, where it eventually became the soundtrack to nearly everything the 1950s had spent so much energy trying to prevent. Chapter 14. A Life Built Around Careful Walls. To be gay in 1950s America meant living inside a country that had simultaneously classified your existence as a mental illness, a criminal offense, and, in a specific and particularly cruel twist, a national security risk, often invoked all three at once by the very same institutions. You're 26 years old in 1954, and you've constructed your life with the precision of someone who understands exactly which parts of it are load-bearing and which parts are not. At work, you're pleasant, competent, and quietly private in ways that haven't yet attracted anyone's particular suspicion. At home, you're careful about what remains visible, careful about who you invite over and when, careful about what you say over the telephone, since party lines aren't private and neighbors tend to notice more than they let on. You wouldn't describe what you're doing as hiding. Exactly. That word implies something shameful, and you've spent considerable time working through that particular argument with yourself already. You'd call it managing. The distance between those two words matters to you, even if, from the outside, the result looks largely the same either way. This climate of suspicion ran in close parallel to the broader anti-communist fervor of the era, in what later became known as the Lavender Scare. In 1950, the U.S. State Department dismissed 91 employees identified as homosexual, framing the dismissals explicitly in the language of national security, the argument being that gay individuals were inherently more vulnerable to blackmail by foreign agents, and therefore represented an unacceptable security risk. The underlying logic here was circular in a way that authorities at the time made little effort to examine. The blackmail risk existed specifically because homosexuality was criminalized and stigmatized in the first place, a condition the government was itself actively maintaining, while simultaneously citing it as justification for further persecution. Between 1947 and 1950, more federal employees were dismissed on suspicion of homosexuality than were dismissed on suspicion of communist sympathies. Gay bars functioned as the primary institution of gay social life throughout the decade, and they operated under more or less constant threat of police raids. Officers would arrive unannounced, demand identification from everyone present, and arrest patrons, often specifically targeting anyone wearing clothing considered gender nonconforming, on charges of disorderly conduct or public indecency. The names of those arrested were frequently published afterward in local newspapers, and this, more than the arrest itself, was often the truly devastating consequence, visible now to employers, neighbors, and family in a way that couldn't be undone. Amid all of this, organizing did quietly begin. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in 1950 by Harry Hay, became one of the first homophile organizations in the country, deliberately choosing that more clinical, less openly stigmatized term over the harsher language of the era. It operated with the same cell-based caution Hay had learned from his earlier involvement with the Communist Party, because caution in this context was simply a matter of survival. Members frequently used pseudonyms. Meetings were held quietly in private homes. The organization's earliest ambitions weren't yet framed around political rights in any broad sense. That language would develop later, but around something more foundational still. The simple, radical act of gay people finding one another, recognizing a shared humanity, and organizing in a culture that would have preferred, given the choice, that they didn't exist at all. What the decade's considerable institutional effort ultimately failed to prevent was private life itself. letters written and carefully kept, relationships sustained in the quiet gaps between official, visible existence, entire networks of friendship and love, maintained through discretion and mutual protection, waiting with a patience born entirely of necessity for a world that might someday be willing to make room for them. That world wasn't here yet in 1954. But the people waiting for it were real and present, and living whole, complicated lives regardless. Chapter 15. The Road That Redrew the Map. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law, launching a construction project that would eventually stretch over 41,000 miles of concrete across the country. A system that didn't just move people from one place to another, but quietly, permanently reshaped where Americans lived, where they shopped, where they worked, and in many cases, which communities they would now never have any reason to encounter at all. You're driving along a stretch of newly completed interstate through Ohio in 1958, and the sensation is genuinely unlike anything you've experienced on a road before. It runs wide, smooth, and startlingly straight, stretching ahead as far as you can see. Older roads had wound their way through the centers of towns, past gas stations, diners, grain elevators, slow farm traffic, and the ordinary, textured rhythm of the American landscape as it actually existed. This new road bypasses all of that entirely. You're moving at 65 miles an hour through a corridor of purpose-built land, and the world outside your windshield feels less like a place you're passing through than a backdrop simply scrolling past you. It's remarkably efficient. It's also, in a way you can't quite name yet, faintly inhuman. Eisenhower's personal interest in a national highway network dated back decades before his presidency. As a young Army officer in 1919, he'd taken part in the first transcontinental military convoy across the country, a grueling 62-day journey along roads so poor that vehicles regularly broke down, sank into mud, or collapsed bridges beneath their own weight. The experience left him convinced that modern infrastructure was, at its core, a matter of national security. Later, as Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War, he'd personally observed how effectively Germany's Autobahn network allowed for rapid military movement across the country. By the time he reached the presidency in 1953, his conviction that America urgently needed its own comparable system had only deepened. This highway construction project would ultimately become the largest public works undertaking in American history, and it required, in the process, the displacement of enormous numbers of people, disproportionately poor and disproportionately black, from urban neighborhoods that happened to lie directly in the path of the planned routes. In city after city, Baltimore, Nashville, Miami, San Francisco, highway planners routed new roads directly through the least politically powerful communities available, neighborhoods that had often existed for generations, cutting many of them cleanly in half or erasing them entirely. Compensation for displaced families was frequently minimal, and many were subsequently relocated into public housing developments that would go on to define American urban poverty for decades to come. The process was documented at the time. It was protested at the time, and it proceeded anyway because the highway had been designated a matter of national priority, and the people standing in its path were, almost without exception, not the people sitting on the planning commissions making these decisions. For the Americans, the interstate served most directly largely white, suburban, and car-owning. Its impact was, without question, transformative in an overwhelmingly positive sense. It connected previously remote regions to the broader national economy. It made long-distance travel genuinely routine for ordinary families for the first time. It gave rise to an entirely new commercial landscape. The highway exit lined predictably with gas stations, motels, and fast food restaurants, creating a strange kind of visual sameness that gave nearly every American landscape, regardless of its actual geography, a recognizable family resemblance. At the same time, the highway quietly completed a project the suburbs had already begun, the structural separation of American life along lines of race and income. Cities, increasingly emptied of much of their middle class and bisected by elevated concrete, became, in the plainest terms, where you ended up if you were poor or black or both. The suburb, accessible now primarily by highway, became where you ended up if you were something else entirely. The road connected the country in theory. In practice, it became one of the most effective tools of spatial segregation the nation had ever built. And because it was, after all, simply concrete and asphalt, it was remarkably easy for most people to call it neutral. Chapter 16. The Face as a Daily Project. In the 1950s, a woman's face wasn't simply her own. It was treated, quite openly, as an ongoing project, something to be assessed, corrected, and maintained daily through a specific and fairly rigid sequence of creams, powders, and careful applications, all in service of a standard that never seemed to arrive at a finished state, no matter how faithfully it was pursued. You sit down at your vanity table in 1953, a piece of furniture whose very existence in the bedroom quietly confirms that maintaining your appearance is understood as its own dedicated domestic task, deserving its own dedicated workspace. You move through the sequence you've long since memorized. Cleansing cream first, to remove yesterday's layer. Then a toner, to close the pores the cleansing cream has just opened, because the beauty industry has, conveniently, developed a product for each half of every cycle it creates. Moisturizer next, because unhydrated skin is understood to age visibly, and visible aging is treated, in this particular decade, as something close to a personal failing. Foundation, carefully matched to your skin tone under the fluorescent lighting of a department store counter, applied by a saleswoman whose own face serves as a walking advertisement for the entire product line she's selling you. Powder over that. Blush applied at the specific angle your favorite magazine insists is most flattering to your particular bone structure. Lipstick, chosen from a range of reds calibrated to the season and the specific impression you intend to make today. By the time you finish, roughly 40 minutes have passed, and none of it to anyone observing you afterward will look like effort at all. That, in fact, is the entire point. The American cosmetics industry expanded at a remarkable pace throughout this period, roughly tripling in overall revenue between 1945 and 1960. New product categories emerged constantly, and rarely in response to any existing consumer demand. The industry, instead, seemed to manufacture the sense of inadequacy first, then arrive promptly afterward with the appropriate remedy already in hand. Dry skin was framed as a problem. Oily skin was framed as an entirely separate problem. Large pores, thin lashes, an uneven complexion, the particular gray cast that comes with genuine tiredness. Each condition arrived with its own specific name and its own corresponding product, described in advertising copy that had clearly studied the language of medical authority closely enough to closely mimic it, without ever quite crossing the legal line into an actual medical claim. Television introduced its own distinct set of demands. The camera read makeup differently than natural daylight did, which meant women appearing on screen, and gradually, the women watching them at home needed to recalibrate their entire approach accordingly. Max Factor's Pancake Foundation, originally developed for use in film production, became something close to a television staple by the middle of the decade. The camera-ready face that read clearly on a small black and white screen slowly became the aspirational standard broadcast nightly into living rooms across the country, with the very products responsible for producing that look conveniently advertised during the commercial breaks in between. A closed loop that ran itself with very little outside intervention required. What was notably absent from the era's beauty culture was any real acknowledgement that aging might simply be an acceptable, ordinary part of life. The explicit, anti-aging product category as it's understood today hadn't fully emerged yet, but the underlying cultural infrastructure supporting it was already firmly in place. Women over 40 who visibly showed their age tended to appear in magazine features primarily as cautionary examples, rather than as anything resembling an aspirational image. The cosmetics industry did offer products marketed toward mature skin, but always with framing that made unmistakably clear this was a problem requiring active management, rather than simply a life stage to be lived through and inhabited without apology. Chapter 17: The Cost of Leaving. In the 1950s, ending a marriage didn't just dissolve a legal contract. It could dissolve your social standing, your reputation, and for many women, the very shape of who you were permitted to be going forward. Divorce was technically legal in every state, but practically speaking, it functioned as a declaration of personal failure so complete that a great many people, overwhelmingly women, simply chose to stay in marriages that had gone cold or cruel or simply exhausting, in ways the culture had no acceptable vocabulary to describe. You've been married for 11 years by 1957, and the marriage itself has effectively been over, in every way that matters, for roughly 6 of them. There was no single dramatic event you could point to, no clear betrayal, no documented cruelty a judge would readily recognize. There was only the slow, quiet accumulation of 2 people who had made a significant life decision at 22, only to discover by 33 that they'd made it without anything close to the information they would have needed to make it well. Your husband isn't unkind, exactly. He's simply absent, in the specific, familiar way this decade tends to produce absent husbands. You've filled that absence for years with children and housework and church committee obligations, and the filling has mostly worked, or at least worked well enough to keep going. But you're 33 now, and you can see quite clearly what 43 is going to look like from here, extended forward at exactly this angle. And you find, somewhat to your own surprise, that you simply cannot do it. What you cannot do, however, is say any of this plainly to anyone in your life. The vocabulary for your particular situation doesn't really exist yet in polite conversation. You could say your husband drinks if he drank. That's a recognized category, with a recognized social response already built around it. You could say he'd struck you, if he had, though even then, the evidentiary bar and the available public sympathy would both sit lower than they arguably should. But you cannot say, out loud to anyone, that you are simply 2 fundamentally incompatible people who have spent 6 years quietly performing a marriage neither of you particularly believes in anymore, and that you would very much like to stop performing it. That isn't a recognized legal ground. It isn't, in this decade, even fully a sentence the people around you would know how to respond to. Most states throughout the 1950s operated under fault-based divorce statutes, which required one spouse to formally prove legally recognized grounds: adultery, cruelty, abandonment, or in some states, additional categories like habitual drunkenness or felony conviction. This requirement to demonstrate fault meant that ending a marriage often demanded either genuine documented wrongdoing, or, quite commonly, an elaborately staged version of it. Couples seeking a mutual, amicable separation would sometimes arrange for one spouse to be discovered by a hired witness in a deliberately compromising situation, manufacturing a paper trail that satisfied the legal standard without reflecting anything close to the actual, far more mundane, reason the marriage had simply stopped working. The social position of a divorced woman in the late 1950s occupied an uncomfortable space, neither fully inside respectable society, nor entirely outside it either. Dinner party invitations grew noticeably scarcer, since dinner parties tended to be organized around couples, and a single woman's presence quietly disrupted the arithmetic hosts had grown accustomed to. Married women often watched her around their own husbands with a specific wariness, operating on the unspoken assumption that a woman who had failed at marriage was somehow now available in ways that threatened the marriages surrounding her. A logic that, on close inspection, revealed rather more about the perceived fragility of 1950s marriages generally than it likely intended to. And yet, quietly and almost entirely without public acknowledgement, many of these women discovered something unexpected on the other side of the stigma. She takes on paid work, or expands the work she was already doing part-time, because her financial circumstances have shifted in ways nobody in her social circle particularly wants to discuss directly. She finds to her own genuine surprise that the work suits her, that it offers something her marriage in the suburbs never quite managed to provide: the specific, unfamiliar experience of being evaluated on the actual quality of her work, rather than on the quality of her domestic performance. At 34, she finds herself freer, in a real and daily sense, than she has been in 11 years. That freedom costs her something in small ways every single day. She would not trade it back regardless. She doesn't say any of this out loud because the decade around her isn't yet ready to hear it, but she knows it privately with complete certainty. And that quiet, private knowing, it turns out, is roughly where the next decade actually begins. Chapter 18: The Decade That Wanted You Pregnant. After the war ended, American couples married younger and had children faster, and in far greater numbers than the generations immediately before or after them. And the surrounding culture treated this not merely as a personal choice, but as something closer to a moral obligation successfully fulfilled. Having children was framed as patriotic. Having several was framed as evidence of health, stability, and properly ordered values. Women who chose not to have children at all were regarded with suspicion, quiet pity, or often some uncomfortable combination of both. You're 23 years old in 1951, married just over a year, and at your mother's Sunday dinner table, your aunt has already asked, for the third time this month, precisely when you and your husband intend to start a family. By which she means, quite specifically, children, since the notion that the two of you might already constitute a family in your own right hasn't managed to gain much traction in conversation, no matter how many times you've gently tried to introduce it. Your neighbor recently had her third child, and duly brought over a casserole to mark the occasion. Your college roommate is expecting her second, and her letters describe the entire experience with a contentment you read and reread, quietly trying to determine whether it sounds entirely genuine. At your last annual checkup, your doctor asked plainly whether the two of you were trying, the word itself carrying its full, considerable weight of expectation packed into 3 unremarkable syllables. You are trying. You have in fact been trying for some time now, and that trying carries its own separate, private pressure layered directly underneath the broader cultural pressure, because in this decade, fertility itself is treated as very much a public matter, open for casual inquiry at any family gathering. Between 1946 and 1964, American women collectively gave birth to an estimated 76 million children, a birth rate significantly elevated above both the preceding and following decades, producing what would come to be known as the baby boom. The basic mechanics of this surge are simple enough to trace. Men returned home from war, couples reunited or newly formed, and a great many long-deferred life plans. Homes, children, some version of a normal future the Depression and the war had both postponed indefinitely, finally began moving forward and moving quickly. What that simple demographic explanation leaves out entirely is the sheer cultural pressure surrounding the choice, which most women of the era didn't experience as a genuine choice at all, in any meaningful sense of the word. This pronatal cultural current ran through nearly every available channel. Popular magazines regularly ran features celebrating large families as tangible evidence of American vitality, accompanied by photographs of smiling mothers surrounded by rows of children, captions emphasizing abundance and boundless energy. Religious institutions across denominations promoted large families as a matter of genuine spiritual virtue. Federal housing policy, including the structure of GI Bill benefits, was explicitly designed around the assumption of a breadwinner plus dependents household model, making the nuclear family arrangement not merely culturally expected, but directly financially incentivized as well. What the culture made almost no room for, meanwhile, was the actual lived texture of the experience from the inside. Postpartum depression wasn't yet a recognized clinical category in routine obstetric practice. Women experiencing it were frequently told they simply needed time to adjust, or advised to try harder, or, quite often, simply handed a prescription for Miltown and sent back home. The genuine isolation of raising several small children inside a suburban house with minimal adult contact throughout the day wasn't broadly recognized as a legitimate source of stress at all. It was simply understood as the life you had chosen, and the choosing, in the era's unspoken logic, largely precluded any legitimate complaint about it afterward. The children born into this specific cultural moment wanted very publicly, and in very large numbers, would go on to become, arguably, the most closely studied generation in American history, their every developmental stage eventually tracked by sociologists, marketers, and in time by themselves, with a degree of open self-examination their own parents, who had rarely been encouraged toward introspection of any kind, sometimes found genuinely bewildering to witness. The generation the 1950s had worked so deliberately to produce would spend much of the following decade quietly questioning nearly every assumption it had been raised inside of, which was, in its own strange historical logic, more or less exactly what you might expect from people raised in households where certain questions were simply never permitted to be asked out loud in the first place. Chapter 19, the decade that called itself simple. Here's the strange, quiet contradiction sitting at the heart of the 1950s. An extraordinary amount of genuine harm was unfolding underneath its surface, and yet the decade's dominant public mood remained relentlessly optimistic, tidy, and forward-facing. Beneath the polished kitchen appliances and the freshly mowed lawns and the cheerful glow of the family television set, there was the constant low hum of nuclear dread, the daily machinery of segregation, the systematic narrowing of women's lives, the quiet medicalization of anyone who didn't quite fit, and the accumulated, largely unspoken weight carried by a generation that had survived both a depression and a world war, only to arrive at prosperity with barely any time to process what they'd actually been through. The 1950s didn't resolve any of this. It simply covered it over carefully, competently, almost artfully, and called the result progress. And to be fair, the covering was genuinely well done. The prosperity itself was real, and it reached further into ordinary American life than any previous decade in the country's history had managed. Wages climbed. Homeownership climbed. The middle class expanded in ways that materially changed the daily conditions of millions of families. If you were white and male and positioned to benefit from the GI Bill and the post-war labor market, the 1950s largely delivered on what it had promised. The house existed. The car existed. The television hummed quietly in the corner exactly as advertised. This was not nothing. For a great many people, it was very nearly everything they had ever hoped to have. But prosperity, it turns out, is not the same thing as well-being. And the decade's great quiet miscalculation was treating the gap between the two as something that could simply be managed, rather than something that actually needed to be addressed. The women whose labor kept the gleaming household running were rarely consulted on whether that household was truly what they wanted. That particular consultation, if it happened at all, had usually taken place years earlier, at an altar, under conditions that didn't include anything close to full information. The Black Americans systematically excluded from the decade's prosperity weren't a footnote to the story. They were, in a very real sense, its structural foundation, their exclusion functioning as one of the actual mechanisms by which the surrounding prosperity was accumulated in the first place. The veterans carrying the war home in their bodies and their nervous systems were handed a house, a job, and a firm cultural expectation of silence, and many of them maintained that silence with exactly the same discipline that had once kept them functioning in combat, simply because it was the only tool anyone had ever handed them. You live in 1957 and the decade tells you, through nearly every available channel, that you have arrived. The Cold War is being managed by people who evidently know what they're doing. The economy continues to grow. The children are healthy. The lawn is mowed. There is, somewhere out there, a bomb capable of ending civilization as you know it, but your desk has apparently been raided for a certain safe distance, and the civil defense pamphlets have been read and filed away, and the matter is, as far as anyone has told you, well in hand. You've taken your Miltown. You've watched your television. You've attended church and the neighborhood association meeting and your child's school play right on schedule. And the performance of an entirely normal, entirely settled life is so thorough and so carefully practiced that for long stretches at a time, it becomes genuinely difficult to tell it apart from the real thing. What leaked through anyway, through the rock and roll records played too loud behind closed bedroom doors, through the quiet meetings of the Mattachine Society held in someone's living room on an ordinary Tuesday night, through the NAACP's methodical, years-long legal strategy building steadily toward Brown v. Board, through the women picking up Betty Friedan a few years later and recognizing, with something close to shock, their own private lives described plainly on the page, was a simple, difficult truth. The performance was quietly costing everyone something. The bill was steadily accumulating in the background the entire time, and eventually the total due was going to exceed what the decade's careful management could continue to absorb. The 1960s, when they finally arrived, didn't erupt from nowhere. They arrived with the specific force of something that had been held under sustained pressure for a very long time. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the broader counterculture that followed, none of it appeared out of thin air. Each of these movements had been quietly assembled, piece by piece, in the margins and gaps of the very decade that preceded it, by people who had spent years paying close attention to the distance between what the 1950s claimed to be and what it actually, on closer inspection, was. The lawn had been beautiful. The appliances had genuinely worked. The decade had, in many respects, successfully convinced itself that it was fine. And underneath all of it, in the particular way of things that are quietly not fine and know it perfectly well, the next decade was already, steadily, being built. And so, here you are. You've made it through a full day inside 1953, through the coffee poured in a kitchen that never quite stopped running, through the casserole assembled without complaint, through the duck-end-cover drill and the television humming steadily in the corner like a second, quieter heartbeat in the house. You've sat for a while with the housewife at her vanity table, with the teenager parked at the drive-in, with the man in the gray flannel suit riding the evening train home, with the woman who stayed, and with the woman who, eventually, found a way to leave. You've heard the rock and roll drifting faintly from beneath a closed bedroom door, and felt the particular weight of certain conversations that simply never happened at all. It wasn't, in the end, a simple time. It was a time that had worked very hard to call itself simple, which turns out to be an entirely different thing. The people living through it weren't naive, and they weren't villains either. They were mostly just people, doing what people have generally always done, quietly managing the distance between the world as it actually was, and the world they needed, at least some days, to believe it could still become. They carried a depression and a war straight into a prosperity that arrived faster than anyone had really been given time to process, and they built the fullest lives they knew how to build, using whatever tools the culture around them happened to hand them. Some of those tools were genuinely good. Some were instruments of real harm, simply dressed in the comfortable, reassuring language of progress at the time. Most of them, if you look closely enough, sat somewhere complicated in between, the way most things tend to, once you actually take the time to look. What they also did, and this is perhaps the part worth holding onto as you drift the rest of the way towards sleep, is keep going. The women who stayed, and the women who eventually left. The men who came home from war and never quite found the words to explain what they'd carried back with them. The black Americans who woke each morning in a country that had decided, quite deliberately, that they counted for less, and who showed up anyway and organized anyway, and changed the law of the land through sheer persistence, courage, and an absolute refusal to accept the story they'd been handed. The gay men and women who kept loving, kept living, kept quietly finding one another in the careful corners of a decade that would have preferred, given the choice, to pretend they didn't exist at all. The teenagers who turned the volume up on exactly the music the adults around them feared most, understanding, somewhere beneath language they didn't yet fully have, that the fear itself was very much the point. They were all, in their own separate and largely unacknowledged ways, quietly building something. Even the ones who had no idea at the time that they were building anything at all. Even the ones who genuinely believed they were simply getting through another ordinary week. So tonight, as you settle further into your own clean sheets, in a room with heating that works reliably and plumbing you never think twice about, and a phone that can reach nearly anyone in the world from the palm of your hand, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the 1950s. Not the version printed on the greeting cards and the nostalgia specials, but the real one. Complicated and contradictory and stubbornly, unmistakably human. The one where people were afraid and mostly pretended otherwise. Where people were unhappy and simply hadn't yet been given the right words for it. Where people were, in their own quiet and largely unrecognized ways, remarkably brave in forms history would only fully acknowledge decades later. They were, in the end, ridiculous and resilient in more or less equal measure, and deeply, unmistakably themselves. And whatever they got wrong, and they got a genuinely significant amount wrong, they also got up again, every single morning and kept going anyway. Which is, in its own unheroic, unglamorous way, its own particular kind of courage. Sleep well. The lawn outside is freshly mowed. The casserole dish is finally cool on the counter. And somewhere, very softly, in a living room you'll never actually see, someone has just set the needle down on a record and the music has quietly begun. Chapter 20. The Suit Nobody Told You to Wear. In the 1950s, fitting in wasn't simply socially useful. It carried something closer to the weight of an unofficial requirement, distributed so evenly across the entire culture that most people never quite felt the pressure of it pressing down on them individually. You work at a large insurance firm in 1955, and you wear a gray suit, a white shirt, and a dark tie, as does every other man on your floor, not because any written policy demands it, but because the social cost of deviating from it is swift and remembered for a long time afterward. A colleague once came in wearing a brown suit, just the once, and the word eccentric attached itself to him within the week and never quite came loose again. You do not wear a brown suit. You've also learned, over time, not to hold especially strong opinions at the office about anything you haven't first quietly measured against the room. You read the temperature before you speak. You speak only once the temperature seems favorable, and you adjust what you actually say accordingly. Late at night, if you're honest with yourself, this particular skill feels less like professional wisdom and more like something you've been quietly doing to yourself for years now, without ever quite finding the right name for it. Author William H. White captured this exact phenomenon in his 1956 bestseller, The Organization Man, describing a generation of men who had, in effect, traded individual ambition for institutional belonging, sanding down the sharper edges of their own personalities to better fit the corporate cultures that employed them, and largely accepting, without much scrutiny, that the group's collective judgment was more reliable than their own. White wasn't entirely condemning this pattern. He understood, clearly enough, the genuine appeal of belonging and the real security that institutional membership offered in exchange. He was simply nomming something the decade generally preferred to leave unnamed, and the fact that so many people bought the book suggested a great many of them had, quietly, been waiting for someone to finally name it. The suburbs enforced their own version of this conformity through sheer visibility. Your lawn was public. Your car was public. Your children's behavior on the street was public. The performance of ordinary domestic normalcy, a well-kept house, a mowed lawn, a properly dressed family visible together at church on Sunday, functioned as a kind of social currency, and falling noticeably behind on it carried its own specific consequence. A quiet withdrawal of standing that was never formally announced and required no formal justification at all. You didn't need to do anything dramatic to lose your place in the neighborhood's estimation. You simply had to stop performing, and eventually the gap became visible enough that it became its own quiet story about you. The most visible dissent from all of this came from the beat writers, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, and the loosely connected communities gathered around them in San Francisco and New York, and the culture's response to them illustrated the entire mechanism with unusual clarity. They weren't typically arrested for their writing itself. Mostly, they were simply ridiculed, called irresponsible, immature, un-American. Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl was formally tried for obscenity in 1957, and though the presiding judge ultimately ruled it was not obscene, the trial itself functioned as its own form of punishment, a clear public message that certain kinds of expression would be met with real institutional resistance, regardless of the eventual legal outcome. The beats had, in effect, named exactly what the decade was quietly doing to people, and were told in return that they themselves were the problem. The counterculture that erupted so visibly in the 1960s wasn't a sudden, spontaneous phenomenon. It was built, patiently and often invisibly, by people who had spent their entire formative years inside this exact conformity machine, absorbing its considerable pressures, learning its many unwritten rules, and quietly, gradually developing the refusal that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Every teenager listening to forbidden records under the bedcovers at midnight, every housewife reading Frieden with that particular jolt of private recognition, every gay man maintaining his careful double life with exhausting daily precision. They were all, in their own separate ways, quietly accumulating what the decade had cost them. And at some point, that accumulation became a reckoning the following decade would have to answer for. Chapter 21. The Box in the Backyard. Somewhere between the glossy automobile advertisements and the church bulletin, an ordinary 1950s household might also find a mail-order catalog for home bomb shelters marketed with a strange cheerfulness, much like any other home improvement product. Backyard installation available, pre-stocked with canned goods. Enough space, the brochure assured you, for the entire nuclear family to comfortably wait out the end of the world in a concrete box buried beneath the lawn. You sit at your kitchen table in 1958, paging through a catalog from a company specializing in home fallout shelters, and the whole document carries a faintly surreal quality, a home improvement brochure that keeps awkwardly bumping up against its own actual subject matter. There are detailed floor plans. The economy model, an 8-by-8-foot concrete block structure rated for a specified distance from a specified blast yield, suitable for a family of 4. The deluxe model adds a chemical toilet and a basic filtered ventilation system. Every model is illustrated with a cutaway diagram showing a calm, comfortable-looking family arranged neatly inside, mother, father, 2 children, seated or reclining, expressions notably serene given the circumstances the illustration is depicting. The federal government's civil defense program throughout the decade rested on a premise that required a truly extraordinary degree of institutional optimism to sustain, namely, that a nuclear attack was genuinely survivable for ordinary families, provided they'd done reasonable advance preparation, and that the difference between a family that survived a nuclear strike and one that didn't came down, essentially, to planning and the right supplies stored in the basement. This premise was, in its own way, necessary. Without it, the entire civil defense apparatus would have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. So it was maintained, with considerable institutional energy, through pamphlets, short educational films, public service announcements, and eventually an entire cottage industry of home shelter manufacturers who grew up quite comfortably in its shadow. Approximately 1.5 million American families are estimated to have built some form of home shelter between the late 1950s and the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, a number that sounds meaningful until it's measured against the roughly 50 million households in the country at the time. Most families who read the catalogs simply didn't build. The financial cost was significant, running into several $1,000s at a time when that represented a genuinely substantial sum. But the more important barrier was likely something harder to put into words directly: a quiet, half-formed recognition, sitting somewhere just beneath the civil defense optimism, that a concrete box in the backyard wasn't really going to solve the problem it was being sold as a solution to. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when it finally arrived, was the moment this entire abstraction became briefly, genuinely concrete. For 13 days in October 1962, the country existed in a state of real, sustained nuclear suspense. Families who had built their shelters stocked them in earnest for the first time. Families who hadn't found themselves wondering, with a very specific flavor of regret, whether they perhaps should have. Then the crisis resolved, and the shelters quietly went back to being unused basement storage, and the catalogs went back to sitting near the back of the magazine rack. The decade resumed its practiced posture of calm, and nobody said out loud, in any real detail, just how close things had actually come, because saying that sort of thing out loud simply wasn't how the 1950s generally preferred to operate. Chapter 22. The age nobody had a name for yet. Before the 1950s, teenager wasn't really a distinct social category in American life. You were a child, and then, fairly abruptly, you went to work or got married and became an adult, with very little meaningful space existing in between. The post-war economic boom changed that almost overnight. Suddenly, families had more disposable income than before. High school enrollment expanded dramatically, and an entire cohort of young people found themselves occupying a strange, newly suspended state, too old to be treated as children, not yet expected to carry the responsibilities of adulthood, and crucially, in possession of both free time and spending money in quantities no previous generation of teenagers had ever had. The market noticed almost immediately. In 1940, roughly half of American teenagers attended high school. By 1960, that figure had climbed to nearly 90%, meaning that, for the first time in the country's history, the overwhelming majority of young people between roughly 14 and 18 were spending their entire days together in the same buildings, sorted by age, developing social structures and cultural reference points almost entirely separate from the adult world surrounding them. By the mid-1950s, American teenagers collectively represented an estimated $9 to $10 billion in annual purchasing power, an enormous figure at a time when a new car cost roughly $2,000. They spent it on records, on clothing, on movie tickets, on cosmetics, and on the specific accessories that marked belonging to whichever peer group mattered most to them. Companies that had previously marketed almost exclusively to adults began producing entire dedicated product lines aimed specifically at teenagers. Teen magazines, teen radio programming, teen television. American Bandstand debuted nationally in 1957, broadcasting daily from Philadelphia, featuring teenagers dancing to current records and rating them for a national teenage audience that used the show, quite genuinely, as a daily briefing on what counted as current and what didn't. You're 15 years old in 1958, and you have a very particular relationship with your blue jeans that your parents don't fully understand and have largely given up trying to regulate. The jeans are rolled at the cuff to a precise, specific measurement. Paired with a plain white t-shirt and a particular style of shoe, the combination reads as an entirely legible statement to every other 15-year-old at your school, and has something close to gibberish to nearly every adult around you, which is, of course, rather the entire point. The uniform itself is the argument. We are a distinct category. We have our own things now, and you don't get to decide what those things mean. Adult reactions to all of this ranged from enthusiastic commercial participation to genuine, sustained alarm. Juvenile delinquency became one of the decade's defining moral panics, running alongside and often tangled up with the broader panic over rock and roll. Senate subcommittees seriously investigated comic books as a potential source of corrupting influence on young readers. Films like Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle depicted teenage alienation with a level of realism that shocked adult audiences and quietly electrified the teenage audiences watching alongside them, who recognized something in these films the adults producing them may not have fully intended to capture. What the decade had, in effect, created was the first generation of Americans equipped with both the economic power and the genuine social space to develop a distinct identity before adulthood fully absorbed them. The full implications of that shift would unfold across the following decade in ways the 1950s could never have entirely predicted, and given the choice, would very likely not have approved of. But by then, the choice was no longer really theirs to make. The teenager as a category had already become real. The market had made it so. And what an entire generation eventually chose to do with that new freedom belonged, from that point forward, almost entirely to them. Chapter 23. The Beautiful Dangerous Machine. The American automobile of the 1950s was, without much argument, one of the great design achievements of the century, and, at the very same time, one of the more reckless consumer products ever mass-produced and sold to ordinary families. No seat belts required by law, rarely any padding on the dashboard, no collapsible steering columns, no laminated safety glass as standard, no headrests, nothing resembling a modern crumple zone. Just gleaming chrome, dramatic tail fins that served no aerodynamic function whatsoever, and a speedometer that, on many models, climbed well past 100 miles an hour. Traffic fatalities during the decade ran into the tens of thousands every single year, and the industry's dominant response, for most of the decade, was simply to make the cars bigger and more visually striking than ever. You're behind the wheel of a brand new 1957 sedan, and it is, without any serious competition, the single most beautiful object you have ever personally operated. The chrome trim catches the afternoon sun with the easy confidence of something that already knows it's going to be admired. The body stretches long and low, sculpted in a way that suggests speed even sitting perfectly still in the driveway. You merge onto the new highway, press the accelerator, and the engine opens up beneath you with a low, satisfying growl. The needle swings comfortably to the right. You find the sensation completely reassuring. The design side of this industry in these years was effectively treated as a form of sculpture. Studios employed full teams to build clay models and full-scale mock-ups, iterating endlessly toward shapes that carried no particular engineering justification at all, but reliably produced in the viewer a physical response somewhere between simple desire and genuine awe. The dramatic tail fin, a signature design element of the era, was reportedly inspired by a wartime fighter aircraft one prominent designer had seen at a preview event, and decided, more or less on the spot, should influence passenger vehicle design going forward. Whether it made the car faster, safer, or more efficient in any measurable way was simply never the operative question. It made the car look like the future, and in 1957, that was considered entirely sufficient justification on its own. The safety question, meanwhile, went largely unasked, mostly because nobody with a direct commercial stake in the answer had much genuine interest in asking it. Annual traffic fatalities throughout the decade ran somewhere between roughly 36 and 38,000, a toll comparable in scale to a meaningful ongoing conflict, distributed quietly across ordinary weekends and holidays and unremarkable Tuesday commutes. The physical mechanisms behind these deaths were well understood at the time by researchers, even if they weren't widely discussed publicly. Unpadded steel dashboards positioned to meet passengers directly on impact, rigid steering columns aimed squarely at the driver's chest, windshields made of glass that shattered into large, razor-sharp fragments, door structures with essentially no capacity to absorb a side impact. Seat belts weren't standard, in part because their presence was thought to implicitly suggest the car might need to stop suddenly in a dangerous way, an implication the industry generally preferred customers not dwell on. Research documenting exactly how these design choices contributed to crash fatalities had been accumulating for years, produced by university programs studying crash mechanics in detail. The data was available. The industry, for the most part, simply continued designing as it always had, operating on the fairly consistent internal position that visible safety features would suggest danger, and that suggesting danger would suppress consumer enthusiasm. In the short term, this was very likely true. In practice, it produced an entire generation of vehicles that looked genuinely magnificent, and killed a significant number of their own occupants with grim, predictable reliability. It would ultimately take until 1965, and a young lawyer named Ralph Nader publishing a book focused specifically on one particular vehicle's dangerous handling characteristics, for the broader public conversation to shift meaningfully. Nader's work used detailed engineering analysis and crash data to argue that these deaths weren't simply unfortunate accidents in any fatalistic sense. They were predictable, preventable outcomes of specific, deliberate design decisions made with full knowledge of the risks involved. Congressional hearings followed. Legislation followed not long after that, and by the late 1960s, seat belts had finally become standard, mandatory equipment. The cars that followed were, by most accounts, somewhat less visually dramatic than their 1950s predecessors. They were also, by a considerable margin, far less likely to kill the people riding inside them, a trade that, viewed from any reasonable distance, seems fairly obviously correct. It simply took the better part of 2 decades to fully recognize the problem for what it actually was, in large part because that problem had been wrapped so attractively in chrome that it was difficult, for a very long time, to feel genuinely angry at something that looked quite that good. Chapter 24: What the Desert Kept Quiet. In the course of the decade's nuclear testing program, the American military positioned thousands of animals, pigs, sheep, dogs, even horses, at carefully measured distances from live nuclear detonations, studying in detail the effects of blast force, heat, and radiation exposure on living tissue. Some of the pigs, notably, were dressed in standard-issue military uniforms, specifically to study how fabric affected the resulting burn patterns. The programs were classified at the time, conducted primarily at the Nevada test site and at various Pacific testing grounds, and described in official government documents using the measured, clinical language typical of scientific research. Viewed plainly, without that clinical framing, they were also something else entirely. You will not read anything about these programs in your local newspaper in 1953. The testing itself is classified. The specific research methods are classified. What reaches the public, in carefully controlled releases from the Atomic Energy Commission, is simply the assurance that testing is proceeding safely, that valuable civil defense information is being gathered for the public's ultimate protection, and that the entire program reflects the nation's serious commitment to security in this new nuclear age. You look at newspaper photographs of mushroom clouds rising over the Nevada desert, and you feel, in the specific way this decade has quietly trained you to feel about such things, a mixture of genuine pride and a faint, largely unnameable unease, which you generally set aside, because the experts presumably are handling it. The pig experiments conducted at the Nevada test site in the early 1950s were among the more thoroughly documented of these biological research programs, and among the ones that most directly confront the underlying reality of what the research actually involved. Pigs were selected specifically because their skin closely resembles human skin in its physiological response to burns, meaning the resulting data translated fairly directly into projections about likely human casualties. Some were dressed in standard-issue uniform fabric, others were left unprotected, allowing researchers to measure the fabric's actual protective value against thermal radiation. Survivors were then monitored closely for the progression of radiation sickness, with detailed records kept throughout. The ethical framework governing this kind of research in the 1950s bore little resemblance to the review processes that would eventually develop in later decades. There was no institutional oversight body comparable to what exists today. The research operated under a national security classification that placed it well outside the reach of ordinary public scrutiny. The scientists and military veterinarians conducting the work were not, by their own account, and by the general standards of their own time, doing anything they considered wrong. They were gathering data judged necessary to understand the practical effects of a weapon that already existed and would very likely be used again if circumstances required it, and understanding those effects on biological tissue required, in their view, actual biological tissue to study. What the decades' considerable machinery of classification and careful clinical language ultimately prevented was any genuine public accounting of what this research actually looked like once you set the technical framing aside. Animals positioned at precisely measured distances from live nuclear detonations, in some cases dressed deliberately in the uniforms of the very soldiers the research was ostensibly meant to protect. Held plainly in mind, without the surrounding institutional language, it's an image that resists the tidy framing the decade generally preferred for nearly everything. The 1950s, characteristically, didn't hold it plainly at all. It filed the entire matter under national security and moved forward, much as it did with a great many other things that were simply easier to manage quietly, out of public view. Chapter 25. The Same Meal in Every Town. Before the interstate highway system finished its work, a hamburger tasted a little different depending on which town you happened to be passing through. By the end of the 1950s, that distinction had begun quietly disappearing, replaced by something new, a promise of absolute consistency, delivered at scale, in a bright red and white building that looked, more or less, exactly the same whether you found yourself in California or Ohio. You pull off the new highway outside a small Midwestern town in 1959, tired from several hours of driving, and there, just past the exit ramp, sits a McDonald's golden arches rising against the evening sky, a menu board offering exactly 15 cents for a hamburger, and a promise printed right there on the sign that this meal will taste precisely the same as the one you might have eaten 3 states back. You order. It does taste the same. There's something faintly reassuring about that, in a country that otherwise feels, from behind a windshield at 65 miles an hour, increasingly unfamiliar mile after mile. Ray Kroc, a milkshake machine salesman who encountered the McDonald Brothers' single, highly efficient California restaurant in 1954, recognized something in their operation that most observers of the era had missed. The brothers had already stripped their kitchen down to a small, rigidly standardized menu, applying something close to assembly line logic to the production of a hamburger, fries, and a milkshake. Kroc bought the rights to franchise the concept nationally, and by the end of the decade, hundreds of identical restaurants had opened across the country, each one following the same layout, the same menu, the same precise cooking procedures, down to the number of pickle slices placed on a standard hamburger. This franchise model depended almost entirely on the new highway infrastructure to succeed at the scale it eventually reached. Predictable traffic flowing steadily past a predictable exit ramp made it possible to build an identical restaurant at nearly any viable interchange in the country, with reasonable confidence that customers would recognize the brand instantly and know exactly what to expect before they'd even walk through the door. Howard Johnson's, following a broadly similar model, had already built a substantial network of roadside restaurants and motor lodges recognizable by their distinctive orange roofs, offering the same reassurance of consistency to traveling families uncertain about a town they'd never visited before. What this new landscape offered was, in a very real sense, comfort through repetition. A traveling family didn't need to gamble on an unfamiliar diner in a town they didn't know. They knew, with total confidence, exactly what a McDonald's hamburger would taste like, exactly what a Howard Johnson's would look like inside, regardless of which state they happened to be passing through. What this same landscape quietly displaced, meanwhile, were the region's own particular diners, its own local specialties, its own idiosyncratic small businesses that had, until fairly recently, given each town along the road at least a slightly different flavor and character. The interstate had connected the entire country. Franchise culture, arriving right alongside it, had begun making a great deal of that newly connected country look and taste remarkably alike. Chapter 26: The Comic Book on Trial. In 1954, a New York psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, arguing, with total confidence and very little rigorous supporting evidence, that comic books were directly responsible for a meaningful share of the country's rising juvenile delinquency, and in some of his more startling claims, that certain comics were actively encouraging homosexuality and violent criminal behavior in the children reading them. The book landed at precisely the right cultural moment to be taken seriously by a great many people who might otherwise have found its central claims fairly implausible. You're a parent in 1954, and you've just read a newspaper excerpt from Wertham's book describing, in alarming detail, the supposedly corrupting influence lurking inside your son's comic book collection. That evening, you go through his room and pull out the stack of crime and horror comics he's been quietly collecting for the better part of a year. You don't discuss it with him directly. You simply throw them out, and he comes home the next day to find the collection gone, with no explanation offered beyond a general, unspecific reference to what's appropriate. Congressional subcommittees took Wertham's claims seriously enough to hold formal hearings in 1954, questioning comic book publishers directly about the content of their most popular titles. Facing the very real threat of federal regulation, the comic book industry moved quickly to establish its own self-censorship body, the Comics Code Authority, which imposed strict content guidelines on nearly every major publisher almost overnight. Depictions of graphic violence were sharply restricted. Storylines involving crime had to ensure, without exception, that criminals were clearly punished by the story's end. The word horror itself was effectively banned from comic book titles altogether. The entire horror and crime comics genre, which had been thriving commercially just a year or two earlier, collapsed within a remarkably short span of time. Publishers who couldn't or wouldn't comply with the new code simply went out of business. A number of writers and artists working in the industry found themselves suddenly out of work, their entire creative genre effectively legislated out of commercial existence by a moral panic built on evidence that, decades later, researchers would find had been substantially overstated, selectively interpreted, and in some specific instances simply fabricated outright by Wertham himself. What the comic book panic revealed, in hindsight, was a pattern the decade would go on to repeat with remarkable consistency across several different forms of youth culture. A genuine, widespread adult anxiety about a changing generation, channeled almost automatically into blaming whatever specific new form of media that generation happened to be consuming at the time, rather than examining any of the deeper social conditions that anxiety might actually have been responding to. Comic books in 1954, rock and roll not long after that, television not far behind either. The specific target kept shifting from one moral panic to the next, the underlying adult unease driving it across nearly all of them stayed remarkably consistent throughout. Chapter 27, The Ledger the Decade Left Behind. If you were to sit down at the close of the 1950s and actually total up its full ledger, not the version printed in magazine retrospectives, but the complete, honest accounting, you would find columns that don't balance especially well against each other, no matter how carefully you try to arrange them. On one side, unprecedented material prosperity, a vaccine that finally ended the annual terror of summer polio outbreaks, a national highway system that genuinely connected a vast country in ways it had never been connected before, a rapidly expanding middle class, and a level of consumer comfort, refrigerators, televisions, reliable automobiles, that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the very same families only 2 decades earlier, in the depths of the Depression. On the other side, a medical and psychiatric establishment willing to surgically alter the brains of women whose only diagnosed condition was simply being unhappy inside the role they'd been assigned. A federal government running weekly drills that taught an entire generation of children to rehearse, calmly and repeatedly, for a nuclear apocalypse that never fully explained itself to them in terms they could actually process. A legal and social system that classified an entire group of Americans as fundamentally less than fully human, and organized nearly every visible institution in daily life around enforcing that classification without interruption. A pharmaceutical and cultural machine that treated women's structural unhappiness as a private chemistry problem to be quietly medicated, rather than a social arrangement genuinely worth reconsidering. Neither column cancels the other one out. That's really the entire point, and it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. The 1950s doesn't need to be remembered as either a golden age or a uniquely dark one, because it was, in the plainest and most honest sense, both of these things simultaneously, depending entirely on which specific window you happen to be standing behind at any given moment. The white, suburban male breadwinner experienced something close to an actual golden age, materially speaking. The woman standing at his kitchen sink, the black family excluded from his neighborhood by deed restriction, the gay man maintaining his careful double life 2 streets over, each of them experienced a version of the exact same decade that looked, from where they stood, considerably different, and in most cases, considerably harder. What made the decade genuinely fascinating to look back on, more than anything else, wasn't really the specific individual facts themselves. The lobotomies, the drills, the segregated fountains, the little pink pills, as remarkable and as troubling as each of those facts remains on its own. What makes it fascinating is the sheer, comprehensive confidence with which the entire culture managed to hold all of it together at once, presenting a single, coherent, cheerful public face over a genuinely fractured private reality, for the better part of 10 full years, before the pressure finally became too much to keep contained any longer. That containment couldn't hold indefinitely, of course. It rarely can. And when it finally gave way over the course of the following decade, it gave way loudly and publicly and in nearly every direction at once, because that is, in the end, roughly how a decade's accumulated debts always eventually come due. Quietly for years, and then all at once. Chapter 28, The Office Before the Weekend. For the American man climbing the corporate ladder in the 1950s, the office wasn't simply a place of employment. It was a second, quieter household, one with its own hierarchy, its own unspoken rules, and its own particular version of the same conformity pressing down on the suburb he drove home to every evening. You arrive at your desk at exactly 8:45 in the morning in 1955, A full 15 minutes before your official start time, because arriving precisely on time is, in the specific culture of your firm, already read as a faint mark against you. Your supervisor believes in visible diligence, and visible diligence means being seated, coat off, coffee poured, before he himself walks through the door. You've learned this not because anyone told you directly, but because you watched, in your first few months, exactly which of your colleagues thrived and which quietly didn't, and adjusted accordingly. The lesson wasn't written down anywhere. It rarely needed to be. The post-war corporate world had expanded rapidly, absorbing millions of returning veterans and a new generation of college-educated men into an entirely new category of white-collar employment, one that offered genuine security and steady advancement, in exchange for a fairly complete surrender of individual expression during business hours. Office culture during this period developed its own dense set of unwritten codes, which topics were safe for lunchroom conversation and which weren't, how visibly ambitious a man was permitted to appear without seeming threatening to his superiors, precisely how long a coffee break could run before it started to register as a mark against you. Company loyalty in this era was treated as something close to a moral virtue in its own right. Many large firms offered their employees a genuine kind of cradle-to-retirement security, a pension, a stable career track, an assumption on both sides that you would likely spend the majority of your working life inside the same organization. This security came at a real cost, though rarely one openly discussed. Advancement depended not merely on the quality of your work, but on a broader, harder-to-define sense of whether you fit, whether your temperament, your visible ambitions, your very personality had been sufficiently smoothed down to match the institution's preferred shape. The commute itself, oddly enough, often became one of the only genuinely private spaces available to a man in this arrangement, 30 or 40 minutes on a train or in a car, belonging neither to the demands of the office nor to the expectations of the household waiting for him at the other end. Some men used this window simply to decompress in silence. Others used it quietly to feel something they weren't otherwise permitted to feel in either setting, a kind of low-grade exhaustion or dissatisfaction that had nowhere else in the day it was allowed to surface. By evening, you're home, dinner is on the table precisely on schedule, and the office version of yourself, careful, measured, endlessly attentive to the room's temperature, gets set aside for a few hours before tomorrow's version of it starts all over again. Nobody in your household calls this exhausting exactly, because nobody has quite developed the language for describing it that way yet. It's simply what a stable, responsible life looked like in 1955. That it also happened to be a genuinely tiring way to spend 30 years wasn't really a question the decade had much appetite to sit with directly. Chapter 29. The Town Too Small for Secrets. Life in a small American town in the 1950s carried a particular texture that suburban and urban life didn't quite replicate. A closeness that could feel, depending entirely on your circumstances, either like genuine belonging or like living permanently under observation. You're a young woman in a town of roughly 2,000 people in 1954, and you understand, without ever having been told directly, that nothing you do in public genuinely stays private for very long. The woman at the general store notices which groceries you buy and in what quantity. The minister's wife notices which pew you sit in on Sunday and whether you've missed a week. Your neighbor 2 houses down happens to be your mother's oldest friend, and anything unusual she observes through her kitchen window will very likely reach your mother's ear before you've finished dinner that same evening. This isn't malicious, exactly. It's simply how a small town functions, a dense, overlapping network of relationships in which genuine anonymity is essentially unavailable to anyone. For families who fit comfortably within the town's expectations, this closeness often functioned as real support. Illness, financial hardship, a difficult birth, these were met reliably with casseroles left on doorsteps and quiet, practical help arriving without needing to be asked for. Small-town life in this era carried a genuine sense of mutual obligation that many urban and suburban residents, moving through more anonymous environments, sometimes envied. But for anyone who didn't fit quite so comfortably, a woman whose marriage was visibly struggling, a young man whose interests or mannerisms read as insufficiently masculine by local standards, a family whose faith or background differed from the town's overwhelming majority, that same density of observation could become something closer to a quiet form of confinement. There was, in most small towns, effectively nowhere to be unobserved, and very little tolerance for behavior that visibly departed from established norms. Word traveled with remarkable speed and required no formal mechanism to do so. Religious identity, in many of these towns, functioned as one of the sharpest and most consequential dividing lines of daily life. In towns with both a significant Catholic and Protestant population, social life often remained quietly, thoroughly segregated along those lines: separate schools, separate social clubs, an unspoken but widely understood expectation that serious courtship, let alone marriage, would stay within one's own denomination. Interfaith marriages, when they did happen, frequently drew disapproval from both families involved, and the couple often found themselves navigating a kind of dual outsider status in a town that otherwise prided itself on close-knit unity. For a great many people who grew up in these towns, the appeal of the city, or eventually the anonymous suburb, wasn't simply about greater economic opportunity. It was, quite specifically, about the possibility of being somewhere nobody already had a complete, decades-long story about who you were. That particular kind of freedom, the freedom to simply not be fully known by everyone around you, wasn't something the 1950s small town could offer, no matter how much genuine warmth and support it otherwise provided. And for some people, that trade was worth making. For others, the warmth was worth the surveillance that came bundled with it. The decade rarely made that choice easy, and it never made it simple. Chapter 30. The Sound Nobody Recorded. There is one more thing worth sitting with before this particular night in history draws to a close. Not a single event or institution, but something quieter, harder to document, and easy to overlook entirely if you're only reading the decade through its headlines and its household appliances. It's the sound of an ordinary evening in an ordinary 1950s household, after the dishes are done and the children are finally asleep, and the television has been switched off for the night. The house settles into a particular kind of quiet that doesn't quite match the daytime version of quiet. In that specific hour, a husband and wife might sit together in the same room without speaking for long stretches at a time, not from any particular tension between them, but simply because the culture surrounding them had never especially encouraged the habit of narrating an inner life out loud, to anyone, including each other. This wasn't unique to any one marriage. It was, in its own quiet way, structural. Men had returned from a war carrying things they'd rarely been given any real permission or vocabulary to discuss. Women had absorbed an entire decade's worth of quiet instruction that their own dissatisfaction, however real, wasn't really a legitimate subject for conversation, but rather a private failing to be managed alone. Therapy, where it existed at all, was reserved almost exclusively for situations understood as genuinely severe: nervous breakdowns, institutionalization, something dramatic enough to override the strong cultural preference for simply not discussing internal difficulty at all. Ordinary unhappiness, the low-grade, chronic kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, had nowhere particular to go. What this produced, across an entire generation, was an enormous quantity of feeling that simply never found its way into any historical record at all. No diary entry, no letter, no interview, because the person carrying it had never been given a framework for treating it as something worth recording in the first place. Historians studying the decade today are left working, quite often, with what wasn't said as much as with what was, inferring the shape of an unspoken interior life, from the specific gaps and silences left behind in the letters, medical records, and oral histories that do survive. It's worth remembering on a night like this that history itself is always somewhat incomplete in exactly this way, that the loudest, best documented parts of any decade are rarely the whole truth of what it actually felt like to live inside it. The 1950s left behind an extraordinary amount of material: advertisements, sitcoms, government pamphlets, magazine features, all cheerfully describing a life that looked, on paper, remarkably put together. What it left behind far less of was the quiet, undocumented texture of what all of that effort actually cost the people living underneath it. Night after night, in rooms with the television finally switched off, saying very little to each other, for reasons neither one of them could have easily explained out loud. That silence, more than almost anything else about the decade, is probably the truest thing that survived it. Chapter 31. The Letter You Didn't Send. Correspondence in the 1950s carried a weight it doesn't carry quite the same way today, not simply because letters took longer to arrive, but because a letter, once written and sent, existed permanently in someone else's hands, in your own handwriting, saying exactly what you'd chosen to say. This made writing one, for a great many people navigating anything remotely complicated in their lives, an act requiring real deliberation. You're a young woman stationed far from home in 1953, your husband overseas with the military, and you've started a letter to him 3 separate times this week, each attempt abandoned partway through. What you actually want to write is difficult, and doesn't fit comfortably into the register your other letters have always used: cheerful updates about the children, brief mentions of the weather, small domestic details meant to reassure him that everything at home continues exactly as he left it. What you actually feel most days now is a loneliness you don't have adequate words for, layered under a low, persistent worry you can't share without seeming as though you're adding to his burden rather than easing it. So the letter you eventually send is the cheerful one. The other version stays folded in a drawer, rewritten in your head more times than you'd ever admit, never quite finished, never quite sent. This particular pattern, the gap between the letter that got written and the truth that didn't, appears again and again in the surviving correspondence archives from this decade, visible mostly by implication rather than by direct statement. Letters between spouses separated by military deployment, by illness, by simple geographic distance during a decade when long-distance telephone calls remained expensive and comparatively rare, tended to follow a fairly consistent emotional register. Warm, dutiful, carefully positive, with occasional small cracks where something truer briefly surfaces before the writer visibly pulls back and returns to safer, more expected territory. Letters between women friends sometimes carried slightly more honesty than letters to husbands did, though even these tended to stop short of anything approaching full disclosure. A woman might admit to a close friend that she felt tired or overwhelmed or occasionally resentful of a particular domestic burden, small, permitted confessions that stayed carefully within the boundaries of what the decade considered acceptable complaint. What rarely appeared, even between the closest of friends, was anything resembling a full accounting of genuine despair, or a serious questioning of the entire arrangement a woman's life had been built around. That kind of writing, when it did eventually happen in any real volume, wouldn't fully surface until the following decade, once a wider cultural permission had developed to put such feelings into language at all. What survives, then, in most family archives from this era is a version of the 1950s written by people who were, in a very real sense, performing even in their most private correspondence, writing not necessarily what was fully true, but what felt sayable, safe, and appropriately contained. The letters that would have told a fuller, more honest story mostly never got written in the first place, or were written and then never sent, or were sent and later destroyed, quietly, by the person who'd written them, embarrassed by their own honesty once the moment that had produced it had passed. What's left behind, as a result, is a written record that inevitably looks a bit more composed, a bit more settled, than the actual lived experience underneath it likely was. Historians reading these letters today have learned, over time, to read as carefully for what's missing as for what's actually there on the page. Chapter 32. The Nurse at the End of the Hall. Healthcare in the 1950s carried its own particular hierarchy, its own unspoken assumptions about whose pain deserved careful attention and whose could reasonably be dismissed with a brief explanation and a pat reassurance. You're a woman in your late 20s in 1955, sitting in an examination room describing a persistent pain you've been experiencing for several months, and your physician, after a fairly brief examination, suggests the issue is most likely related to nervous tension, a diagnosis that, in this particular decade, functioned as something close to a catch-all explanation for nearly any physical complaint reported by a female patient that didn't present with an immediately obvious cause. He recommends rest, perhaps a mild sedative, and sends you on your way within about 10 minutes of your arrival. The actual underlying cause of your pain, whatever it eventually turns out to be, remains uninvestigated for months longer than it likely should have. This pattern reflected a broader medical culture in which women's physical symptoms were disproportionately attributed to psychological or emotional causes, rather than investigated as potential physical conditions in their own right. A tendency with roots stretching back through much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and one that remained thoroughly embedded in mainstream medical training and practice throughout the 1950s. Conditions that would later be well understood and properly diagnosed: endometriosis, autoimmune disorders, a range of chronic pain conditions, were, during this decade, frequently dismissed with vague references to nerves, stress, or a woman's supposedly excitable temperament. The nursing profession itself, meanwhile, occupied its own particular and fairly rigid position within this medical hierarchy. Nurses in the 1950s were overwhelmingly women, and the profession operated under an extremely clear and closely enforced deference to physician authority, regardless of a nurse's own accumulated clinical experience or direct observation of a patient's actual condition. A nurse who disagreed with a doctor's assessment had very few sanctioned channels through which to raise that disagreement, and doing so too directly, or too often, could genuinely threaten her position. Nursing schools of the era explicitly trained young women not only in clinical skills, but in a specific, carefully calibrated posture of professional deference that today reads as remarkably rigid. And yet, within these real constraints, nurses frequently functioned as the actual continuity of care for hospitalized patients, present at the bedside for entire shifts at a time, while physicians moved quickly between numerous patients on brief rounds. Patients often confided far more in their nurses than in their doctors, partly because nurses were simply present far longer, and partly because the power differential, while still real, felt somewhat less intimidating than the one patients experienced with physicians. The broader medical culture of the decade, taken as a whole, reflected many of the same assumptions running through the rest of 1950s society: a firm confidence in established authority, a general reluctance to seriously question expert judgment, and a particular skepticism toward women's own reported experience of their bodies whenever that experience didn't fit neatly into an already recognized diagnostic category. It would take several more decades, and considerable sustained advocacy from within the medical field itself, before this pattern began meaningfully shifting toward taking women's physical symptoms with the same immediate seriousness routinely extended to men's. Chapter 33. What the Postcards Didn't Show. Family vacations in the 1950s occupied a strange and specific cultural space, genuinely treasured, carefully documented in photographs, and at the same time, often quietly exhausting for at least one member of the family in ways nobody photographed or wrote home about. You're a mother packing for a 2-week family road trip in the summer of 1956, and the packing itself has fallen, as it generally does, almost entirely to you. Clothing for 4 people, meals planned for a full week of driving before you'll reach any reliable grocery store, a first aid kit, entertainment for restless children confined to a back seat for hours at a stretch. Your husband will drive, and driving, in the division of labor this particular trip has quietly assumed, is understood to be his full contribution. Everything else belongs to you, including managing the children's moods, rationing snacks, and somehow ensuring that everyone arrives at each planned photo opportunity looking cheerful and well presented for the camera. The rise of the family road trip during this decade was itself a direct product of several converging forces already discussed: the new interstate highway system, the post-war affordability of the automobile, and a growing culture of standardized roadside motels and restaurants that made long-distance travel with children genuinely feasible for the first time for a broad swath of American families. Kodak's marketing throughout the decade leaned heavily into this new culture of family travel, encouraging families to document these trips extensively, producing the specific genre of cheerful vacation photograph that fills family albums from this era in extraordinary volume. What these photographs reliably show is a carefully composed version of the actual experience: children smiling in front of a scenic overlook, a father posed proudly beside the car, a mother smiling from the passenger seat. What they don't show, and what rarely made it into any letter home either, was the considerable invisible labor required to produce that single composed moment. The packing, the meal planning, the managing of sibling conflict in a hot, cramped back seat for the 6th consecutive hour, the quiet exhaustion of being, functionally, on duty the entire time even during a trip explicitly framed as leisure and rest. This gap between the documented version of family life and its actual daily texture runs through nearly every institution and ritual this entire history has touched on so far: the kitchen, the classroom, the office, the vacation. The 1950s was, in a very real sense, a decade that photographed itself constantly and photographed itself well. What it rarely managed to capture, in any form that survived for later generations to easily access, was the considerable effort quietly required to produce each of those carefully composed images in the first place. The smiling family in the postcard-perfect photograph was real. So, generally, was the exhaustion standing just outside the frame. Mostly unrecorded and largely uncomplained about, because complaining, in this particular decade, simply wasn't where the story was ever really supposed to go. Chapter 34. Closing the lamp left on. We've now spent a very long night together inside a decade that worked exceptionally hard to look simple, and turned out, on close inspection, to be almost anything but. We've sat in the kitchen before sunrise, in the classroom during the drill, in the drive-in, in the asylum, in the segregated waiting room, in the vanity table's careful sequence of creams and powders, in the small pink tablet dissolved quietly into an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. We've heard the record hit the trash can, and the rock and roll still playing anyway, later, under someone's bed covers, at a volume too low for anyone else in the house to notice. None of what you've heard tonight is meant to erase the genuine warmth that also existed inside these same years. The real security many families found for the first time, the real joy of a first television arriving in the living room, the real relief of a vaccine finally arriving in time to end a summer's worth of fear. Both of these versions of the decade are true at once, layered directly on top of each other, inseparable from one another no matter how cleanly the nostalgia reels eventually tried to separate them. What made the 1950s worth this much of your evening isn't really any single fact from tonight's list. It's the recognition, sitting underneath all of it, that every era convinces itself, to some degree, that it has finally arrived at something stable and settled, and that history, almost without exception, eventually reveals the quiet costs that stability was actually built on. The 1950s isn't unique in this. It's simply unusually well documented, unusually photogenic, and unusually confident in its own performance of having gotten everything more or less right. The people who lived through it, as we've said before tonight, weren't naive, and they weren't villains. They were mostly doing the very human work of managing an impossible gap between the world as it actually was and the world they needed on most days to believe it could still become. Some of them managed that gap by staying quiet. Some managed it by slowly, carefully beginning to speak. And what they built between them, quietly, across an entire decade of very ordinary days, became the foundation the following decade would stand on to ask its far louder questions. So, as you finally let yourself drift the rest of the way towards sleep tonight, picture, if you like, one last small image. A lamp left on in a quiet living room, long after everyone else in the house has gone to bed. A record still spinning faintly on the turntable, the needle nearing its final groove. And somewhere just outside the frame of that peaceful, well-lit room, everything this history has spent tonight quietly nomming, still there, still true, simply no longer hidden from view. Sleep well, the lawn is mowed. The casserole dish sits cool and empty on the counter, and the record, very softly, has almost reached its end.